Our story begins with a thought. If hell truly exists, then it is before your very eyes. A wounded man calls out to the young man before him. Your Majesty, Burin. We see him in a state of shock, still struggling to comprehend the situation. He calls out to the young man, Kiri, who confirms with a heavy heart that this is all he could do. Burin erupts in furious denial, commanding Kiri not to give up, urging him to take up his sword and fight once more, at any cost. But it is too late. His great and loyal friend has just breathed his last on the battlefield. Burin continues to refuse the reality before him, consumed by grief for his fallen friend. Then, slowly, he picks up his friend's sword, screaming in anguished despair. A tremendous surge of aura explodes from within him. All of this takes place in a land forged by dragons and humans, called Karis. Karis demands tribute from his homeland, Socretia, a treasure known as the Axis of Time. As he mercilessly cuts down his enemies, he reflects that their refusal of Karis's demand was justified. Lost in thought, a spell is cast behind him. Turning to face the spellcaster, he realizes it's too late. He loses his hand in the attack. This is the beginning of a war. Still burning with rage, the man grips his sword tightly in his remaining hand. This war will mark the end of his nation. This is Burin, the great king of Socretia. Suddenly, another mage begins to chant a spell. Glory to Karis. The magic aimed at him is immense. He can already taste death. Yet, his resolve remains unbroken. He will never let them stop him. As the magic hurtles closer, Burin parries the attack, roaring that he is the sword of Socretia. Just then, several figures approach. These are the mage forces of Karis. Among them is Balkan, the strongest mage, orchestrated by the Mad King of Karis. Blanche. Burin stares in fury, recognizing these are the men who have turned his country into a living hell. One of the mages steps forward. He introduces himself as Arson, commander of Balkan's forces. Now face to face with his enemy, he asks for Burin's name. But as Burin prepares to attack, he declares he has forgotten everything. He charges forward with blinding speed, shouting that he is but a sword, serving his king. His opponent merely scoffs, unleashing a spell of ice. He says he will remember him. He attacks with full force, vowing to remember the king of Socretia. Burin is struck down, his vision blurring. In that moment, his life flashes before his eyes. The destruction of his beloved country. The moment all light vanished. Sunlight streams into his eyes. A voice urges him to wake up, calling him Prince. Two lords stand before him, asking if he had a good dream. They tell him he needs to hurry, as Prince Planche has already left. The now awakened man couldn't understand why Planche's name was being mentioned. His last memory was of his arm being struck. Of course, the vassal didn't understand what he meant by his arm being separated from his body. This confused everyone around him and made them wonder if he'd had a nightmare. The vassal quickly asked if he was all right, but in that moment, he just wanted to figure out why anyone would mention the name of someone he loathed so deeply. He wondered how his arm had regenerated, as he'd never seen such regeneration before. As memories that didn't belong to him flooded his mind, he asked the vassal who he was. When the vassal replied that he was Kalian Line Cyrus, he was stunned. This was because he had been reborn into the enemy's camp as the third prince of Cyrus. His hands trembled, fear gripping him. He questioned his own name in his mind. He remembered those who had attacked him, wondering what had happened to him. He quickly asked the vassal for today's date. They replied that it was April 28th. He then asked what year it was. The vassal said it was the year 522 and asked if there was something wrong with the prince. Terror seized him, sweat beading on his brow. What was happening couldn't be real. He had woken up 10 years before the last war. The war had begun when a strange object with the power to rewind time suddenly appeared in the palace. It was the Axis of Time. News of it spread rapidly. The ruler of the Karis continent also began to covet the object. He questioned what they meant by Karis, demanding they hand over the Axis of Time. They were powerful, but this object belonged to them. They couldn't hand over such a dangerous object to an enemy nation, no matter the cost. Therefore, they immediately refused Karis's request. The war began swiftly, as if they had been waiting for it. The man pleaded with Burin not to join the war, saying that all who participated had died. He couldn't lose any more of what he had left. That day, Kaihingnan must have witnessed Burin's death. The man cried out, calling for his friend, saying if only he could return to a time before that object appeared. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he couldn't comprehend what was happening. The vassals, startled by his sudden agitation, asked where the prince was going. He quickly opened the window. wondering if Kai Hungnan had somehow used the axis of time to return to the past. He stared out the window, as if trying to grasp something. It suddenly occurred to him that this might be his last chance to prevent Socretis's downfall. A vassal interrupted his thoughts, saying they understood the difficulty of attending breakfast, but it couldn't be delayed any longer. The prince then apologized for making them wait and said he would get ready now. In his mind, he vowed that if he was to make the most of this opportunity, he would live as a prince of Cyrus. The door opened, and someone announced that the third prince, Kalyan, was now coming to dine. He then entered the room. Someone was already seated at the table. The vassal awkwardly apologized for the delay, saying he should have been quicker. Seated at the table, sipping coffee, was Randall Zell Cyrus, the eldest of the 3 Cyrus princes. Each prince was a half-brother, all sharing the bloodline of the Holy Tensor. By the king's decree, breakfast was prepared for the 3 princes every morning. But as far as Burin's memory was concerned, he would always be Burin. Now, Kalyan apologized for his tardiness, while Randall continued to sip his coffee, as if he didn't exist at all. He sat in his chair, still incredulous at being so blatantly ignored, and prepared to drink his coffee, thinking that only one brother remained. Just then, the second prince, Planche, walked in, without even an announcement of his arrival. He casually took a seat, ready to dine. Kalyan was taken aback by his appearance, as he wasn't dressed in formal attire. He wondered to himself which royal in the world would walk around dressed like that. His astonishment led him to question whether this was truly the mad king he'd heard of. Meanwhile, an attendant served Planche's coffee. Kalyan, gauging the Mad King's actions, began to think the title might have a different meaning. He shifted his attention to Randall and recalled that the first prince couldn't provoke the second. The current queen of Cyrus was Planche's birth mother, and no one in the royal palace dared to challenge her authority. He continued to sip his coffee, wondering how he would survive in such a place. Just then, Planche noticed the third prince drinking his coffee, and called him impertinent, startling Kalyan. He turned his gaze to the second prince, who was now looking at him. Planche went on to say that he had no manners. After all, he took after his mother. Kalyan, enraged, began to grit his teeth. He slammed his cup back onto the table in frustration, thinking he had to endure all of this because he couldn't lose this chance. Images of the war flashed through his mind, and his anger towards Planche intensified. Kalyan glared at Planche, feeling the urge to end the Mad King right then and there. Just then, Planche looked back at him with a menacing gaze. A cup fell to the floor and shattered, creating a mess. Planche had thrown it to the ground. He raged at Kalyan, demanding to know how he dared look at him that way. Randall quickly tapped his cup against his plate, drawing their attention. Planche immediately looked at him with a surprised expression, then turned a disdainful gaze back to Kalyan, who seemed taken aback by the situation. Planche began to scratch his head in frustration, swiftly knocked over his chair, and said he was leaving the room. With his back to the 2 princes, he said he'd lost his appetite because of that filthy, red-eyed brat. Kalyan, stunned by everything that had just transpired, looked at the first prince to see his reaction. However, he simply told him to behave. Randall said that His Majesty's birthday was approaching, and he asked if he intended to cause a scene with such a special day so near. Kalyan, still shocked by the whole situation, didn't say a word. He simply wondered if the situation was truly his fault, and not Planche's. Just then, a servant asked him if he was all right or if he was injured. He quickly began cleaning the prince's foot, soiled by the shattered cup, muttering that not a day went by without some incident. Kalyan thought to himself that at least he had one loyal servant, one who cared for him as if he were tending to his own body. Kalyan rose and placed a hand on the servant's shoulder, thanking him for his care. The servant, startled by the gesture, looked up in surprise. He thought the prince would simply weep in silence. As he looked at the prince's face, he saw a smile. The first queen of Cyrus, Lonxisphania, had hair as black as the night sky and eyes like sacred fire. Kalyan was the only prince to inherit her features, though the power he possessed was weak. Kalyan always tried to hide his red eyes. Looking at his eyes in the mirror, he thought, since Planche hates my eyes. Just then, Planche came up behind Kalyan and sneered, disgusting eyes like blood. The lingering memories of the prince, from before he'd awakened in this body, made him uneasy. Looking up at the sky, wondering why Kalyan had been so afraid to show his eyes to someone like Planche, he muttered under his breath, "Idiot." A nearby servant asked if he was all right or if he needed anything. The prince replied that he was fine and that they should return now. The The servant, surprised by his demeanor, remarked that he was acting strangely today, asking if he'd perhaps been reading a novel about gentlemen. The prince replied that he hadn't. The third prince, born of a commoner concubine, was afraid of many things. He had no one to support him, and he was too weak to even defend himself. Shortly before his coming-of-age ceremony, Kellyan, about to return to his room, told the servant to wait. He turned to the servant and asked his age. The servant, confused, replied that he would be 15 in 4 months. Kellyan's breath hitched. He remembered that Kellyan had been murdered before his birthday. He had tried to poison Queen Celeste, failed, and then, fearing punishment, hanged himself. That was the story the public heard. He thought, but no one believed it was true. Sweating, he concluded that someone would be coming for him soon. The door opened abruptly, and he quickened his pace. A servant called out to him, but he continued towards the window. The servant told him to slow down. His mind raced. Kellyan had only a month or 2 left to live. Since he didn't know what had happened to his original self, he needed to do something. The servant warned the prince that he might fall, but was cut off mid-sentence by the prince's request for scissors. The servant, shocked by the unusual request and not quite understanding, went to fetch them. He returned with the scissors, still bewildered, and handed them to the prince. After the prince took the scissors, the servant asked why he needed them. The prince then moved the scissors towards his hair. To change some things, the prince said. As he began to cut his hair, he thought, if there is a predetermined future, I will twist it. All the servants in the room were in a state of panic, asking him what he was doing and saying that Prince Planche wouldn't like it. He replied that he couldn't live like a fool forever, just because Planche didn't like something about him. He told everyone to calm down, assuring them there was no need to worry, and with a determined expression, declared that he would handle the situation. They proceeded to breakfast. Just then, Prince Planche entered, demanding incredulously if Kellyan had gone mad. The servants were utterly shocked by the prince's sudden appearance. Was this what Kellyan meant by handling the situation? Planche thought to himself, casually taking a seat at the table. "Hey, Red Eyes," he sneered. Before he could finish, Randall, taking a sip of water, interrupted him. "Kellyan," he corrected, then looked at Planche with a faint smile. "His name is Kellyan." The second prince, Planche, remarked sarcastically that perhaps he should indeed call him that, as he lightly picked up a knife. Suddenly, Planche shouted, demanding that Kellyan acknowledge him. He flung the knife. Everyone was startled by the sudden action. They watched as the knife flew towards Kellyan's servant. Randall calmly observed the scene, his expression unreadable. The knife struck, and blood dripped onto the floor. It was Kellyan's blood. He had caught the knife mid-flight, suffering a minor cut to his hand. The servants cried out in alarm, fussing over the wound. Kellyan stared intently at Planche while the servants shrieked that the prince was injured. Planche, with a mocking tone, suggested that Kellyan's hand must have slipped. He added sarcastically, "Oh dear, Kellyan's hand is hurt." Kellyan gave a small smile and quickly stood up. He placed the knife beside Planche, stating that he was fine. Planche stared at him in surprise. The actions were so unexpected. Kellyan, claiming the injury was nothing, left the room. Returning to his quarters to tend to his hand, his servant suggested calling a healer, but Kellyan dismissed the idea. Kellyan showed the bandaging, stating it was just a small cut. The servant, still frightened, tried to argue, but was cut short by Kellyan calling his name. He questioned why the servant hadn't dodged Planche's attack. Kellyan continued to press the servant, stating that he knew the attack was meant for him, and asked what the servant would have done if he hadn't intervened. The scene of the incident flashed through his mind. He muttered that he should have been able to avoid such an attack. The servant replied that if he had dodged, Planche might have used it as an excuse to harm Kellyan further. Kellyan stood and went to the washroom, explaining that his heart was racing because of the incident and that he would calm down after washing his face. The servant tried to insist on helping the prince, but Kellyan replied that he would do it himself and not to call a healer. The servant, on the verge of tears, wondered why a healer couldn't be summoned. Inside, Kellyan considered that earlier, when Planche attacked, he had almost instinctively used aura. But he felt a sudden pang in his chest. Then, with a surge of resolve, he thought he should try again. To confirm the state of Kellyan's body, he focused on quickly releasing aura. He began to channel it, but then he felt something different in his chest, 3 circles near his heart. He was surprised by what was happening and what he felt. A question followed. Was Kellyan a mage? Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the young prince's room. Kellyan nervously wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to appear composed. His servant, Randall, remarked that it had been 3 days. Randall exclaimed, his voice laced with concern, that Kalian's injury hadn't improved at all and that he should do something about it. But the prince insisted, his voice trembling slightly, that he was fine. Randall started to speak again, but was interrupted by a man dressed in red. The man introduced himself as Sutton Slate, the royal tailor. Kalian, mistakenly called Baron here, asked what he wanted. Sutton bowed his head, already starting to apologize, and quickly mentioned Freya. Randall cut the tailor short. The tailor apologized for mentioning her name. Kalian, seemingly mistaken for Baron again, supposedly grew tired of the reactions he received after cutting his hair. Kalian, having long suffered for resembling his mother, Queen Celeste, had begun to hate the sight of his own face to the point of breaking all the mirrors. So, Kalian, again referred to as Baron, paid it little mind, saying it was all right. He knew he looked like her, and told the tailor to do what he needed to do. The tailor began taking Kalian's, or Baron's, measurements, commenting as he worked that the prince should eat more. Because he was thin, Kalian, still being called Baron, said he ate well enough. The tailor, afraid to contradict him, agreed. Looking at himself in the mirror, Kalian thought that this would eventually cause others to worry. The Cyrus royal family were descendants of dragons. More precisely, they were descendants of 2 of the 8 heroes who sealed the evil god. They were the hero Hacula and the heroine Sasfanian. Sasfanian bestowed upon the Cyrus royal bloodline the power of healing and a magical ability known as Sasfanian's blessing. In other words, Kalian's injury should have long since healed, but hadn't. Kalian, while the tailor took his measurements, thought about the pain he felt in his heart every time he used mana. He worried because if this continued, he wouldn't be able to use mana and he would die when the assassins came. The tailor finished taking his measurements and said he would prepare some clothes for His Highness to wear for the king's birthday. But Kalian only wanted to know if there was anyone there who understood mana, though something quickly caught his attention: the king's upcoming birthday. Kalian grew anxious because the king, the great mage Elon Manasur, would be there, and Kalian longed to meet him. Elon Manasur was one of the 3 seventh circle mages among the 4 traveling merchants, and an idol to all magic users. In the past, Elon had been invited to the king's birthday and visited Cyrus. The story went that some incident led to him being turned away at the gates of Sandia. Elon hadn't been able to attend the celebration, and 10 years later, his abilities had grown, and he had been promoted to an 8th circle archmage. Sitting in his room, Kalian thought that only Elon knew enough about mana to be able to help him. Looking out the window, he thought that due to some incident, Cyrus wasn't very friendly towards mages, so Elon might not agree to his request. The reason countless knights traveled through the kingdom of Cyrus was due to the influence of Planche's mother's family, the Brezin clan. So Kalian believed that if he could get Elon on his side, he might be able to stop the war Planche was about to start. The commotion in his room drew Kalian's attention. The royal tailor, Sutton Slate, and his assistants were fussing over his attire for the king's birthday, debating the placement of ribbons and lace. Kalian shook his head. No ribbons, no lace, he declared. Randall, his servant, looked surprised. But your highness, he began, wouldn't a touch of lace. Kalian cut him off with a raised eyebrow. Do you think I look good in lace, Randall? The day began like any other. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Birds sang in the trees outside, and Kalian sipped his tea. He finished his tea, reflecting that he was growing accustomed to this life. Almost. His hand had almost completely healed. Planche had been ignoring him since the breakfast table incident. Randall informed him of his schedule: riding lessons in the morning, dinner with the Queen and Viscount Brezin at 7 that evening. Kalian frowned. Viscount Brezin. Is dinner with Viscount Brezin, he repeated. Randall confirmed, explaining it was in honor of the king's birthday. Kalian sighed inwardly. So, he would have to deal with the Viscount after all. As Randall helped him dress, the servant inquired about his endurance training. Just a run by the palace lake, Kalian replied. He left his room with a forced smile. Don't worry, Randall, he said. What could possibly go wrong? Arriving at the training grounds, Kalian began his exercises. He was soon breathless and drenched in sweat, feeling as though he were about to collapse. I'm dying, he thought. His trainer, who had been observing him from behind, gasped. Your Highness, are you all right? She exclaimed, her voice laced with concern. Your endurance is declining. She was the daughter of the vice commander of the Outer Defense Force. Kalyan leaned against a tree, gasping for air. He heard the trainer comment on how the number of laps he ran was decreasing daily. I am training, he thought, sweat dripping down his face. And my endurance is definitely getting worse. Something is wrong. If it's too difficult, Your Highness, the trainer suggested, we should call a healer. Kalyan shook his head vehemently. No need. I'm Ufine. He knew that if a healer were called, his secret would be exposed. The mana circuits. Not even Randall knew that Kalyan was a mage. If he acted rashly, his life could be in danger. It's just a lack of stamina, Kalyan insisted. A healer wouldn't be able to do anything. The young trainer tried to argue, but he stood firm. I'm Ufine. I'll get better with time. Suddenly, shouts echoed from the distance. Eyes forward. Observe the enemy's movements. Kalyan and his trainer quickly turned towards the source of the commotion. The knight's training had just begun. A man in the center of the knights bellowed, urging them to train harder so they wouldn't die on the battlefield. Kalyan watched intently as the knights trained with fierce determination. It brought back memories. This is the Pabar Knights training ground, his trainer remarked. I know, Kalyan replied. I'm watching because I find it interesting. She looked surprised. Have you never handled a sword, Your Highness? I've only recently become interested, he admitted. Do you know what kind of place the Pabar Knights are? She asked. Yes, Kalyan answered. They're the knights of the Brezin clan, meant to act as a check on the king's power. A figure approached them. Who is this? He demanded. It was the Pabar commander. He addressed Kalyan directly. If you have no business here, you should leave. He added that the knights were bothered by being watched, and he couldn't train properly. Baron looked around and saw all the knights glaring at him. The young trainer shouted, demanding Pabar show respect, as he was Kalyan. The third prince, Pabar, said with a dismissive tone that he hadn't recognized him. With a mocking smile, he added that he thought it was a sneaky mongrel rat. Baron looked at the commander with a wicked smile. The young trainer stepped in front of him and yelled at the commander, demanding to know how he dared speak such reckless words in front of his highness. The commander said he almost made a mistake and asked why she was so sensitive, as the prince wasn't that important. Pabar turned his gaze to the prince, shocked by what he saw. The prince was completely different, behaving much more intimidatingly. He remembered a past incident where he yelled at the prince to get out of his way as he was leaving. The prince, frightened, pressed himself against the wall and apologized to the commander. He had assumed Kalyan was weak and timid, but now he looked different. The prince appeared bolder, stronger, his gaze firm. Pabar felt a more powerful aura emanating from the prince, and it unsettled him. Baron said he wanted to ask the commander a question. With an angry expression, he asked Pabar what his duty was. The commander was terrified, sweating nervously, afraid of the young prince. Just then, two knights approached the commander and asked him what was going on. They saw the prince and wondered what he was doing there, as even the knights looked down on the third prince. The commander said they were in the middle of training, so he couldn't respond and told him to carry on with his duties. Baron stood firm, while his trainer was shocked by the prince's behavior. He bravely repeated the question to the commander. What was his duty? Everyone was taken aback by the prince's actions, as it wasn't like him. The commander noticed his knights whispering amongst themselves and felt embarrassed by the situation. Pabar replied that his duty was to strengthen the royal forces and protect the royal family and the kingdom. Baron picked up a branch from a tree and said that was precisely what he should be doing. He snapped the branch swiftly, gripping it tightly, and declared that the commander was failing at both of the duties he had just mentioned. An enraged Pabar asked what the prince was talking about. Baron replied that if the commander was supposed to be strengthening the royal forces, his training looked like a mess. With the branch in his hand, Baron launched a swift attack, leaping behind Pabar, poised to strike the commander. Pabar was terrified, thinking he had to block this attack at all costs. He already anticipated that if the attack landed, he would die swiftly. He grabbed his sword, drawing it from its sheath. He managed to block Baron's attack at the last second. The commander was horrified by what the young prince was capable of with just a branch. Baron continued to press hard against Pabar's sword. With a smile on his face, he released the branch that was pressed against the commander's sword. The blow sent Pabar's sword skittering across the ground, the commander's grip torn away. Baron turned, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. Disappointing, he murmured that the commander of the Pabar Knights couldn't anticipate the movements of someone who supposedly never wielded a sword. Still reeling from the shock, Pabar struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The prince's speed had been blinding. You dare address a prince, a protector of the realm, with such disrespect. Baron's voice, though quiet, dripped with ice. And then you draw your sword against him. His gaze bored into the commander. Should this be considered treason? He asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Pabar stared back, a flicker of recognition dawning in his eyes. Could this truly be the third prince? Understanding flooding his features, Pabar dropped to his knees. Your Highness, I beg your forgiveness. I wasn't thinking clearly. My mind has been clouded with worry these past few nights. Terror laced his voice. Please, Your Highness, I swear I had no treasonous intent. Baron watched him, impassive, as the disgraced commander remained prostrate before him, begging for mercy. Face pressed against the dirt, Pabar swore he would never forget this humiliation. He would carry the weight of the third prince's scorn for the rest of his days. Meanwhile, Yin, Baron's servant, watched the scene unfold with wide, disbelieving eyes. But, Your Highness, he stammered, you went out for stamina training? He trailed off as Baron, leading a magnificent black horse by the reins, approached with a grin. This is Raven, Baron announced, handing the reins to the bewildered Yin. I picked him up along the way. Yin gaped at him. Where did you even go? As the dust settled from the confrontation between the prince and the commander, Baron's acquisition of the horse became the new focus of attention. The horse, known for its wild spirit and resistance to any rider, had been the bane of the knights. No one had been able to tame it. Its strength and untamed nature were legendary. Then a thought struck Baron. He remembered. The horse belonged to Planche. Yin was stunned. The prince had brought back Planche's horse. Planche mentioned anyone could use him, Baron explained casually. Lowering his voice, he added, and Yin, keep what happened with Pabar to yourself. Yan's voice trembled. But what if the second prince finds out? Baron offered a reassuring smile. It'll be all right, even if he does. Suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed through Baron's chest, causing him to double over slightly. Both servants gasped. Clutching his chest, Baron cursed inwardly. He'd pushed his body too far. Your Highness, is the stamina training too much for you? Yin asked anxiously. Baron shook his head, forcing a smile. No, I just had a bit of fun with someone afterwards. Unseen, a figure watched the three of them from the shadows, then quickly melted away. Let's have dinner in the gazebo in the garden, Yin, Baron instructed. Elsewhere, a seated figure received a message from another. He held a flower delicately in his hand. Even insects writhe when they're stepped on. He mused, his voice soft. He tightened his grip, crushing the delicate petals. But those born like him, no matter how much they writhe, they can't change their origins. He tossed the mangled flower to the ground. Simply crushing and killing them is no fun. Let's watch for now. The three princes gathered once more for a meal. Baron, despite being there every day, still felt a sense of unease in the formal setting. Something was different about Prince Planche. Baron observed him, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. Why did Planche seem so downcast today? He sipped his wine, wondering if the Queen and the Viscount were the reason for Planche's late arrival. Planche, he realized, wasn't very good at hiding his emotions. The dining hall doors burst open, jolting everyone from their seats. All eyes snapped towards the entrance. A familiar scent wafted towards Baron, and a surge of elation coursed through him as he recognized the figure stepping into the room. Resplendent in a stunning green dress, her baby blue hair a striking contrast, it was the Queen, the true power behind the throne. The second of her name, and current ruler of Callus, Queen Ceres Brezin. After the previous queen's demise from illness, Ceres, wielding the formidable influence of her family, had seized control of the royal knights and ascended to power. With the majority of the nobility backing the Brezin clan, her authority had only solidified over time. As a result, the third prince, Kellyan, had become a figure of diminishing importance, even in the eyes of the Viscount, a minor commander who accompanied the Queen. The Viscount informed her of their intended course of action regarding Pabar, to which she assented, promising appropriate compensation. Taking her seat at the table, she instructed the Viscount to refrain from reporting such trivial matters in the future. He acknowledged her command with a curt affirmation. Her gaze then fell upon Baron. Why, she inquired, should I concern myself with such insignificant affairs? Yumi, her expression a mask of stern indifference, watched the Queen. The rest of the dining hall remained silent, observing the unfolding scene with bated breath. The Queen then addressed Kellyan, who turned his attention towards her. She remarked on his recent growth spurt. A faint smile touched his lips, surprising her with his unexpected reaction. He lifted his goblet. I'm still not tall enough, he replied. The smile lingered as he added, I assure you, I will grow taller still. The other two princes exchanged glances of astonishment at his bold response. The queen regarded him with a flicker of annoyance. The Viscount, ever eager to please, interjected that his height was of little consequence. As the Viscount spoke, Planche shot a furious glare at Baron from the corner of his eye. Planche's mother, the queen, leaned towards him and murmured, Why didn't you tell me about this? He responded with a confused, Tell you about what? She was referring to his horse's disobedience. Planche remained oblivious to his mother's meaning until realization dawned, and he turned away, shamefaced. It would have been better, she continued, if you had told me sooner. He retorted that she already knew. Planche gripped his fork in frustration as the queen pointed out that he had never mentioned the horse's refusal to obey. He slammed his fork onto the table. That horse, he spat, was useless from the start. He rose abruptly. I'm leaving. His outburst startled his mother, the queen, who called after him. 3 weeks passed, and the king's birthday arrived. The palace staff worked tirelessly to ensure the celebrations proceeded without a hitch. Several horses laden with gifts for the king arrived at the palace. Anticipation for the grand banquet filled the air. The banquet promised to be a lavish affair. The kingdom buzzed with excitement, wondering if the princes were prepared for the festivities. Meanwhile, the royal tailor, Sutton Slate, was rechecking the measurements he had previously taken for Callian. He noted a discrepancy in the measurements and puzzled over the change. He was about to ask Baron if Callian had been eating properly when a drop of blood interrupted him. He crumpled to the ground, his eyes locking on a Baron's face, startled by what he saw. The young prince's nose was gushing blood, and he seemed utterly shocked by what had just transpired. The servants immediately rushed to Baron's aid. His personal servant, Yin, called out for another servant to fetch a cloth, while Baron insisted it wasn't that serious. He explained it away as a consequence of recent sleepless nights, but Yin was persistent, arguing that lack of sleep wasn't the real issue. The tailor interjected, stating that the nosebleed wasn't the only problem. He pointed out that the young prince had also thinned considerably in recent days, the weight loss noticeable on his frame. As the bleeding began to subside, Baron acknowledged internally that he had indeed been losing weight. A smile touched his lips as he attempted to alleviate their concerns, claiming that he'd been training rigorously over the past few days. Baron's thoughts turned inward. He had been pushing himself hard, yet his stamina seemed to be deteriorating. Every time he used his magic, a searing pain shot through him. He suspected something must be wrong with Callian's heart. The tailor, his voice laced with concern, said it wasn't something to take lightly and asked if he'd had it checked. Baron dismissed the suggestion, claiming it wasn't necessary. He inwardly cursed his luck. Why did he have to have a nosebleed in front of so many people? The tailor tried to reason with the prince, but Baron firmly insisted he was fine. Then Yin spoke up, declaring that they couldn't simply ignore the matter. The nosebleed, he announced, was due to Baron's habit of picking his nose. He went on, saying it must have been difficult to admit such a personal habit to everyone. Baron was stunned by his servant's words, while the other servants began to murmur amongst themselves. Yin concluded that since the prince had been eating and exercising well, the nosebleed must be attributed to his habit. The tailor readily agreed, reasoning that Yin knew the prince better than any of them. Yin then looked at Baron with a grin and a wink, leaving a bewildered Burns in his wake. Baron later recalled Yan's concern for his condition earlier that day. He had confided in Yin about his ability to use magic, and that his problems were magic-related. The prince felt a bit foolish, wondering if Yin had intentionally decided to sabotage his image. However, he was relieved that his servant had managed to concoct an excuse to get them out of that situation. The tailor then mentioned that he would alter the clothes as he had previously discussed. He seemed hesitant, citing the limited time, but Yin assured him that the prince had other matters to attend to first, so there would be ample time. The tailor was pleased to have the time to complete his task, but as he left, he leaned in and whispered to Baron, calling him by name. He nervously asked if it was happening today. Baron grew pensive, anxiety gnawing at him about the impending event. He knew that regardless of his health, he needed to see May Garen. The matter would spread throughout the palace, so before that happened, he had to see the mage, Elon, at all costs. Lunchtime arrived, and they headed towards the dining area, only to be informed that lunch had been canceled due to an emergency. They were told they would be meeting with everyone individually, one after the other. Baron was taken aback by the sudden change of plans, wondering how they would have time time for individual meetings with everyone. Wouldn't it be more efficient to see them all at once? Baron thought to himself, but nevertheless, he followed closely behind the steward. They arrived at the first room, Baron feeling a knot of apprehension in his stomach. He hadn't anticipated a private audience. The door opened, and someone informed Baron that His Majesty was waiting for him. He stepped into the room and saw a man sitting on a sofa, reading a newspaper. It was King Roman Larun Cyrus of Cyrus. He remained engrossed in his newspaper as Baron, the third prince, greeted His Majesty. Afterward, he slowly straightened, trying to make eye contact with the king, but something both shocked and surprised him. The king didn't seem to notice his presence at all, continuing to read his newspaper. Baron thought to himself that while he didn't always strictly adhere to the etiquette of Callus, he knew this behavior was rude. Finally, the king gestured for him to sit. The prince congratulated the king on his 38th birthday. The king asked him how he had been, still focused on the newspaper. The king commented that the prince looked healthy. This surprised Baron. The prince recalled all his servants worrying about his health, and he thought that even a passing servant would know he had recovered quickly. The prince understood why the king met with them one by one, even if only for a short time. If he met with his 3 children at once, he would have to focus on the conversation. So, meeting one at a time was easier, because for him, spending time with the children who wanted to congratulate him was a waste of time. Baron found this family custom strange. A father who didn't care for his children, a first prince indifferent to everything that happened, and a second prince with no manners, reeking of alcohol and treating the servants terribly. As Baron finished his thought, someone entered the dining hall. The king, in an annoyed tone, remarked that she was late. It was the queen who had just arrived. She retorted sarcastically that it just so happened. As the queen entered with a sardonic smile, Baron concluded she held enough power to disregard the king. Then he chuckled inwardly, thinking that someone among them wanted him dead. Just then, a servant called out that the event was about to begin. Baron tried to figure out who would send someone to kill him. As the princes appeared before the people, someone commented to another that he had completely changed compared to before. The second prince, Planche, seemed utterly drunk. It was the queen and king who commented on this. She concluded that it wouldn't change anything. People were just making a fuss while sipping their wine. The king said that something was different, not like before, something had changed. Then the third prince was announced. He walked into the hall, capturing everyone's attention, leaving everyone stunned by what they saw. So the rumors were true, people thought. Those present saw the prince with black hair and red eyes, reminiscent of Suspania. The prince's new appearance captivated everyone, especially since he had cut the bangs that previously obscured his face. He also wore a bright red brooch that accentuated the color of his eyes. Thus, it indicated he would no longer hide. The prince smiled brightly, and everyone noticed his attire. Then his servant, Yin, whispered in his ear, asking why everyone was staring at him. All eyes were on Baron, the third prince. After posing his question, Yin wondered why everyone was staring at his attire. Then, realization dawned on him. He declared he knew the reason, and Baron, intrigued, looked at him expectantly. The attendant, brimming with cheerful confidence, asked if it was because he looked handsome, adding that Sutton would be delighted to see him like this. Baron was taken aback by Yan's words. Then, regaining his composure, he stated that they were staring because of the jewelry he wore, explaining that he remembered how difficult it had been for the tailor. He told Yin he was glad it ended there. It could have been worse if he had worn everything. Yin, however, insisted that he looked magnificent. As they walked through the hall, Baron inquired whether Yan's family was in Kalisa, the capital of Callus. Yin was surprised he remembered. His attendant then explained that his sister and father had returned to their hometown, but the rest of his family still resided in Kalisa. Baron then asked if they would be coming to the palace. Yin replied that they would if they received an invitation. Baron stopped and looked at him, a subtle shift in his demeanor suggesting a desire to change the subject. Yin asked when he should have the raven waiting in the garden. Baron realized he was hesitant to answer. There must be something he didn't want to talk about, the prince mused. He answered Yin, saying they would wait for the right moment. The prince mentioned a desire to meet someone, a statement that surprised his attendant. Baron then asked Yin if he knew why this hall was called Siegfried. Yin replied that of course he did. It was named in honor of Duke Kitros Hans Siegfried, one of the first patriarchs and a war hero, the only Duca family of Callus. The Siegfried family, despite their considerable power, had remained loyal to the royal family for over 500 years, steadfastly dedicated to defending the territory of Suspania. Baron recalled being impressed when he first heard this story as Baron Yin. Yin asked if the person he wanted to meet was... Before he could finish his question, the prince answered in the affirmative. Just then, a booming laugh caught their attention. A man remarked that summer nights in Siegfried were always classic. Then Yin informed the prince that he was there, Duke Slayman Han Siegfried, a remarkably elegant man with a neatly trimmed beard, long hair, and a bright smile gracing his features. Baron felt a surge of respect. He admired families with such enduring loyalty. He began subtly releasing his magic, a subtle test of the Duke's acuity. Slayman quickly noticed the use of magic in the area. His gaze shifted directly to the third prince. Locking eyes with Baron, he realized the magic emanated from him. Baron ceased releasing his magic, satisfied that Slayman had perceived it instantly, even though he had only released a sliver of his power. Yin noted that the Duke had shown interest in the prince. The prince, aware that Slayman was one of the 5 greatest swordsmen on the continent, knew it would be impossible for him to go unnoticed. He decided it was too early. He instructed Yin to pretend he hadn't noticed Slayman's gaze, and then turned, moving out of sight. Slayman continued to watch them depart, certain that the power had originated from the young prince. A short while later, the king raised his glass, thanking everyone for their congratulations and telling them to enjoy the night in Cyrus. Baron and Yin subsequently slipped out the window with a rope they had prepared beforehand, making their way to the gardens where Planche's unruly horse awaited. At Burn's command, the horse stood waiting for the third prince. The horse was calm and docile, even earning praise from the prince, though Yin warned him not to be fooled. However, seeing the horse's behavior before Burn's, Yin conceded that the animal did seem intelligent. His servant inquired whether they should head to the main gate, to which the prince replied that no one could currently enter without an invitation. As they neared the gate, they noticed a commotion among the guards. A visitor was insisting he had traveled a great distance, but even so, he was informed he could not enter and was politely asked to leave. Baron observed the scene, surprised, for he recognized the visitor. The visitor asked the guards if he was being denied entry for lack of an invitation. It was Elon Manisil. As realization dawned on the guards as to who the man on horseback was, shock rippled through them. They grew apprehensive, whispering amongst themselves. Then one of the guards stated that even if Elon claimed to be himself, he still required an invitation. Elon chuckled beneath his hood. He remarked that it was a pity Cyrus distinguished its guests based on appearances. Baron, listening from afar, was taken aback by the mage's words. He thought that judging people by their attire was indeed an issue, but he also realized Elon wasn't simply criticizing for the sake of it. He seemed to be trying to find an excuse not to enter Cyrus. Elon then turned his horse, stating he would return soon. Baron watched the mage depart, thinking he couldn't miss this opportunity. His servant, as if reading his mind, said they couldn't leave. The king's orders forbade anyone from departing during the festivities. As Elon slowly rode away from Cyrus, Baron realized that if things continued this way, they would soon lose him. He told Yin to delay the guards at all costs, while he quickly mounted his horse and rode towards the gate. As he pulled away from Yin, who was trying to call him back, Baron only urged his horse faster. The guards at the gate shouted for the prince to halt his horse immediately. They proceeded to inform him that the king's orders forbade departure. With a display of masterful horsemanship, the prince's horse leaped past the soldiers and swiftly made for the exit. The guards were stunned by this turn of events. The horse's speed was remarkable, and the guards shouted against the wind that the prince had left Cyrus. They rushed to their own horses, immediately giving chase. Yin, still shocked by everything, was unsure how to help the prince in this situation. He remembered the prince's command to delay the guards at all costs. Then, steeling his resolve, he declared internally that he was the attendant of the Prince of Kalyan, and his duty was to protect the prince at all costs. He boldly shouted for all the guards to halt immediately. He claimed that Duke Siegfried had granted Kalyan permission to leave, but one of the guards retorted, demanding to know who he was to use the Duke's name in such a manner. He undid his hair, revealing, "I am Soroyan Siegfried." His hair whipped in the wind as he declared himself the eldest son of Duke Slayman Han Siegfried. A moment later, booming laughter erupted. Yin, or rather, Soroyan, sat awkwardly as the man beside him roared with laughter. Still blushing with embarrassment, Soroyan mumbled that it wasn't something to be so proud of. He then called out to his still chuckling father, admitting he couldn't believe his son had done something so clever. Like a father teasing a child, the Duke joked spoke that his son had gone and gotten himself a little wealth. The Duke then added that Yin had made a good decision, but Yin replied that it wasn't, saying His Highness might ruin his relationship with the king. Yan's father told him he wouldn't pry into what happened. Yin was surprised by this reaction and his father's calmness, his father repeating that he wouldn't ask anything about what transpired. Roman is overthinking this. If the boy has Siegfried's help, it will put him in a cautious position in terms of us offering aid. If there is a relationship where he receives help but isn't punished, it would be tantamount to admitting a friendly relationship between our family and the prince, and Bryson would criticize this. If that happens, all of this could be swept under the rug, as if nothing happened, Duke Siegfried concluded. Meanwhile, the prince was still chasing after the mage, Elon, and was almost upon him near the fountain. Elon sensed his presence and remarked that the prince didn't seem to be there to scold him for his lack of invitation. He asked why the third prince of Cyrus was tailing an old man like him. Baron remembered hearing that after mages reached the seventh circle, the aging process reversed. It seemed it was indeed true. The prince then said it was getting late and asked if Elon intended to leave just like that. Elon replied that as he tried to open a closed door, it seemed the threshold was still too high. Baron didn't understand what he meant, whether it was a subtle hint or something else, but he knew he couldn't do anything for Elon. So he said that Elon went to a closed door while another was open for him, and asked where the criticized invitation was. Facing Elon, Baron said he blocked the wind, forgot to clear the dust off the threshold, and didn't expect the guide to make a mistake. The mage was surprised by the way the prince spoke, wondering if the prince was being honest or just brazen. Elon gave a small smile, thinking the prince was quite interesting. Looking at the prince, he recalled that when he first saw him, he didn't have the look of a 14-year-old boy, and he noticed something in his hand. Elon noticed something different about the prince, which immediately caught his attention. He called out to the prince, who was waiting for him to finish speaking, and then Elon abruptly asked for a moment's pardon, grabbing his hand. Pulling it closer, Baron didn't know what was happening and wanted to ask what he was doing, but Elon began to use his magic, attempting to activate magic within Kalian's body. This caused Baron to feel the familiar heartache he always experienced when using magic. Elon's mana flowed into Kalian's body, causing Kalian's mana to repel Elon's, creating a small explosion that pushed them apart. The horses startled and backed away from each other, Baron's heart still aching intensely. Elon then remarked that even with the door closed, the wind couldn't be completely blocked. Baron realized Elon had noticed his condition. He echoed Elon's words, asking, "The wind can't be blocked." Baron acknowledged that Elon was right in a way, because he couldn't use his magic. Elon thought to himself, the problem isn't the mana, and wondered if the prince truly didn't know why he couldn't use it. Looking at the prince's hands, he concluded that if he didn't know, the real issue lay elsewhere. So the mage stared intently at Baron as he clenched his fists. The Callus family mistreats mages, even though they are descendants of dragons. The Archmage had come of his own accord, intending to make fools of them, but now here he was, meeting with the young prince who had followed him to this place. Elon pondered this, then asked the prince why he had sought him out. Baron, still breathless from everything that had happened so quickly, started to speak, but he knew the mage would sense it if he lied, so he began, speaking truthfully to Elon. Dismounting his horse, Baron stated that he wanted Elon's name. As he slowly approached the mage, he said he believed his life would soon be in danger. The prince concluded, "I am not unaware of the third prince's predicament." Elon watched the prince speak, thinking, this prince is simply hated by everyone, a prince surrounded by enemies. Then a spell was cast around the two of them, its speed startling Baron as Elon leaped from his horse. A silent spell, Baron thought, still amazed by the mage's ability to cast without uttering a word. Elon asked the prince what his true objective was. "Do you simply want to stop this from happening?" Elon asked the prince. "Or are you trying to eliminate the true cause?" He asked again. The prince replied that, for now, he just wanted to stop it from happening. Elon was surprised by the young prince's answer. The prince continued, saying that he truly wanted to eliminate the root of the problem. He concluded that if he needed to ascend to the throne to achieve his goal, then so be it. Elon, with an incredulous smile, thought the throne is nothing more than a tool to achieve his goal, and he himself is a dying prince. This prince, who bears a striking resemblance to someone from Suspania, needs his help to achieve his goal, Elon concluded. The mage found it all incredibly intriguing and became quite excited. Then the mage requested the invitation again, telling the prince to show him what he possessed. Without hesitation, the prince knelt before the mage. He introduced himself, saying, "My name is Colin Ryan Cyrus," and offered his respects to his new mentor. Elon Manisil accepted His Highness's invitation. Looking at the young prince kneeling before him, Elon thought to himself that he would save his life. We return to Yin, who was speaking with his father, asking him if he was certain that people didn't know who he was. The Duke replied that he had taken care of it, and Yin needn't worry. Yin said that if he were recognized, he couldn't stay there. As the Duke continued to speak about Yan's identity, a young man remembered something and, feeling a bit anxious, asked about someone named Leah. He asked after Leah's well-being, a question that caught his father's attention, silencing him mid-sentence. He replied that she was doing well as the head of the family in Yan's absence. The Duke rose to his feet, stretching languidly. He told Yin that he was welcome back any time he wished. Sighing, he added that he didn't think they would see each other again for a long while. Yin, head bowed, questioned his father's words, pointing out they would meet again in 3 months. The Duke, taken aback by his son's remark, asked if he was truly considering relinquishing his position as the prince's attendant. Yin remained lost in thought, his gaze still fixed on the ground. He replied that he would soon be 15 years old. His father, surprised by the answer, simply watched him. Then, he called out to his son, who looked up at him intently. He asked if Yin knew the Siegfried family's nickname. Yin replied that he did. Before he could voice the answer, his father chuckled and confirmed he was correct. He explained that they were known as the Elephants of Cyrus. For a long time, they had not contended for the throne, yet they knew their own formidable strength. They were called the Kings of Beasts, untouchable even by other creatures. The Duke concluded pensively. He began to ask Yin why he suddenly, but was cut short by a tight embrace from his father, who declared that their name held immense power. Still holding his son close, he told him to do whatever he desired. Yin clutched his father's arms, exhilarated by the words he'd just heard. Then his father began to playfully pinch him, calling him a rascal and causing him to fret, while Yin pleaded for him to stop, as it hurt. Father and son continued to revel under the beautiful night sky. Composing himself once more, Yin resumed the role of a servant, addressing his father as Duke Siegfried. The Duke questioned this formality, ordering him to disappear at once. Yin then bowed to his father, bidding him farewell until their next meeting. The Duke sat on a bench, watching him depart, and remarked that this ridiculous stubbornness only confirmed that he was indeed a Siegfried. His thoughts then drifted back to the moment in the hall when the prince had unleashed his magic. He wondered when the prince had grown so much. He gazed up at the beautiful, full moonlit sky, pondering what the prince truly intended to do. The next day, at the break of dawn, the sky was a sea of blue, dotted with white clouds. As horses approached, a carriage pulled in, its occupants incredulous at the sight before them. Was that truly that crest? 7 red flowers and a silver king marked the emblem. A woman remarked to the man beside her that she'd heard his contract with Reverland had ended. The man questioned how he was faring now, and Cyrus, considering all he'd been through, wasn't an obvious choice. The woman asked, wouldn't he have left long ago, if not for the king? She wondered if it was because of the rumors they'd heard earlier. The man asked if it was true, the rumors about Elon Manisil's son. As the man spoke, a figure emerged from the carriage. It was Elon Manisil, clad in black and white robes, his hair flowing freely. He emerged, a smile playing on his lips as he considered the rather charming thing his new disciple had done for him. He recalled the young prince's request for him to arrive precisely at 9:30. He'd also been instructed to walk through a specific open door at that exact time. Elon wondered if His Highness was attempting to rival the Bryson family. If so, it wouldn't be an easy feat. Colin Ryan Cyrus, the prince known as Baron, was waiting for the opportune moment to introduce the mage to the nobles and shift the current political landscape. Then, a figure approached, expressing surprise at Mage Manisil's sudden visit. It was a group of servants, informing Elon that His Highness had been expecting him and was currently taking tea with someone. The servant inquired about the nature of the conversation. It was the king taking tea with the mage and questioned Elon as he had requested lodging. The king asked again, confirming whether the mage truly desired lodging within Cyrus. Elon, with an air of calm, replied that he did indeed wish to find accommodations in Cyrus. The king then pondered the mage's sudden request. He'd been thinking that in order to compete with Celis, One needed power like Elon Manisil's, but he hadn't expected the mage to be the one to propose this first. He then attempted to discern Elon's plan. As Elon sipped his tea, he mentioned seeing a black cat with red eyes in the square the previous night, which left the king somewhat perplexed. The mage continued, explaining that the cat seemed intelligent, and he wished to teach it a few things, but lacked a place to stay. This surprised the king. The king asked what Elon intended to teach the cat. Elon replied that he wanted to teach it magic. Of course, he added, it wasn't just that. He also wanted to create an environment the cat would enjoy. If he were to do so, he would need to assist the homeowner and also tidy up the house. The king, taken aback, realized that Elon seemed to know everything. He asked Elon if he possessed the ability to handle all of this. Elon knew that with Colin as his disciple, Bryson wouldn't be able to interfere and he could assist the prince unimpeded. He told the king that all these ideas stemmed from Prince Colin's genuine invitation. The king slapped his hand against his leg and abruptly stood, declaring that he would arrange accommodations for Elon. Elon smiled inwardly, thinking that the house was already in disarray, so nothing could make it much worse. The king then remarked that he was curious, as he'd heard the boy wasn't anything special. Elon asked, not special. He thought to himself that even Colin's health was unnecessarily special, to the point where it was difficult to find anything normal about him. The king continued, saying he'd heard the boy had many fears, even a fear of horses, yet still followed him. The mage was surprised that the king only spoke of things he'd heard from others. The king added that if the boy were special, he would have known. Elon interrupted the king with a question. Perhaps you are unaware of the prince's circumstances. The mage pressed further, questioning whether the king knew the true extent of the prince's predicament. The king looked at the mage gravely, and Elon received his answer. The king knew nothing about his son. Elon had said that sometimes attention is a poison, indifference an antidote, but he knew full well that being busy was just an excuse, the mage concluded. The king, stunned by what he had just heard and the mage's audacity, said he would take Elon's apparent unawareness of his station as a sign of concern. As Kalian's mentor moved towards the door, the king said that it was absurd that this had to be explained, but he took his princes very seriously, especially Kalian, who was precious to him. He added, his hand on the doorknob, beginning to say that it was best to end this conversation. But before he could finish, Elon snapped his fingers, and a silencing spell was cast around them. Elon, having startled the king and captured his attention, told him to stop stalling, to which the king asked what he was doing and how he was using magic within the palace. Elon began to explain about Kalian, whose lips were dry, breath ragged, skin a bluish purple, and the underside of his fingernails a purplish red. His clothes were clearly adjusted in a hurry, and, considering they had been prepared a month prior, he must have lost a lot of weight. He tried to stand but couldn't lift his body, his eyes closed, feeling dizzy. The king, shocked by the many facts Elon stated, was told that if he remained a mere bystander, he would lose everything. A maid approached Yin, who was standing by the prince's door, mentioning that it was almost lunchtime, and the prince hadn't had his morning tea yet. So he took the tea from her, saying he would be careful in case the prince coughed. He entered the room to find the prince still asleep in bed, looking tired and thin. The previous day had been a bit hard on him, Yin thought to himself. Just as Yin was about to wake the prince, Elon suddenly appeared behind him, asking if the prince wasn't awake yet. Yin only then realized the mage's presence. At first, he didn't know what was happening, but then, startled, he threw the tea tray into the air, scolding the mage for appearing out of thin air. He asked how Master Manisil could do such a thing, to which Elon replied that he'd heard strangers weren't allowed in the palace without permission. So you teleported in without permission? Yin asked. The mage replied that it was a more difficult rift and that he was very good at magic. Yin, regaining his composure, told him to leave, as the prince was in poor health. Before he could finish, Elon took a step closer, asking if he didn't recognize him. Elon said Yin had visited Reverland a few years ago. Did you think I wouldn't recognize you just because you've grown? Elon asked, calling him Little Elephant, which greatly surprised Yin. He remembered his father saying no one would suspect he was his son. I've been caught, and rather quickly, Yin thought to himself, his face shocked. The prince then awoke amidst their conversation, asking how long he had slept. Before answering, Yin told the prince he had a visitor. The prince, sitting up, asked who it was and spotted Elon in his room. Addressing him as teacher, Elon handed Prince Colin, known as Baron, a small red pouch containing something. The prince untied the string, opened the pouch, and asked what it was. He poured a few small spheres into his hand. Elon instructed him to take one each day, without fail. Baron inquired if it was medicine. Elon told him he was currently facing two problems. The first was the prince's inability to control his magic, and the second was his rapidly declining weight. The prince remarked that, even without being told, Elon seemed to fully understand what was happening to him. Elon then asked the prince if he possessed the power of blessing. The prince confirmed, stating it granted him the ability to heal and an affinity for magic. Baron recalled that despite this, even his healing ability seemed to be fading. He remembered the time he injured his hand. He asked Elon if there could be something wrong with his heart. Elon now asked gravely if he had ever considered that it was a strange combination. This gave the prince pause. Baron said he wondered if the power of blessing had strengthened his heart, since both magic and the origin of life resided in the heart. Elon affirmed his question, stating that the power of blessing did indeed strengthen the heart. Then, with a serious expression, he stated that his power of blessing hadn't vanished, nor was his heart failing, and his magic wasn't blocked. The curious prince asked what it was then. Elon asked if he had never considered this. What if Sushchin's blessing hasn't disappeared, but is being used to its limit elsewhere? Elon asked. The young prince was taken aback by Elon's words, believing the power of blessing was so diminished he couldn't even heal a small wound. He then fearfully asked Elon if there could be some kind of poison inside him. If it weren't for the blessing, you would already be dead, the mage replied. The prince, horrified by all of this, listened as Elon explained that treating such a lethal poison put a great strain on his body, and his healing abilities were stretched to their limit. Furthermore, he was trying to use magic in this state. Because of this, his heart was rejecting the attempt. Baron reflected on what was happening to his body. Originally, Kalyan was the one who was supposed to be assassinated, but he had already been poisoned before he was possessed by Baron. This wasn't planned beforehand. Baron thought angrily, wondering why they would hang a child who was going to die anyway. Elon noticed the young prince's rage. He thought, this isn't the bloodlust a 14-year-old should have. Just what is he? As Elon finished his thought, Baron, holding one of the pills from the pouch, said this must be the antidote. The mage confirmed, saying it was hastily made, but he was certain it would work. As Baron held the pill, he looked at Elon curiously and asked, what if I told you I'll take the poison and the antidote together? He held the pill aloft. Elon was surprised by the young prince's question. He replied, even if you take the antidote, if you also take the poison, it will only delay the effects. Baron replied, that's enough. Elon was surprised by his response, asking if he truly intended to juggle both the poison and the antidote, and whether he already knew who was responsible. Baron said he had some inklings, explaining that he suspected the source of the poisoning was the tea he drank every morning, as he drank it in front of everyone, and no one else partook. Did Kalyan notice the changes in his body and refuse the tea? Perhaps that's why he was assassinated, Baron thought. He knew things had changed after he inhabited this body, so he wasn't sure what method they would use to eliminate him next. He told Elon that until he figured it out, he needed to keep everything confidential. The mage asked if that was truly the only reason. Baron said that if he revealed the morning tea was the problem, Yin and the other servants would be in danger, and that wasn't something he wanted. The culprit had been doing this regularly, so they were confident they wouldn't be caught. The prince sighed as he spoke. Elon said the little elephant would be fine. Baron didn't understand what he meant, but the mage simply told him to forget it. Elon said that, in any case, he understood Baron's situation, and he asked what Baron planned to do next. Within his memories, Baron recalled a man calling him a fool and telling him that it takes someone's trump card. You first had to put down your own. In moments like these, I think of you, father, he concluded. He then asked Elon to escort him out of the palace the next morning. The day began with someone yelling, waking Prince Kalyan and urging him to get up as the door abruptly swung open, and someone quickly entered the prince's chambers. His servant tried to wake the prince, but was quickly ordered out by the person who had entered. She ripped back the curtains of Prince Kalyan's bed. It was the queen. You're late in preparing for your afternoon itinerary, don't you think? She asked. Kalyan, bare-chested, sat up in bed, looking exhausted. The queen recoiled at the strong smell of alcohol. She asked him if, despite being forbidden from drinking, he still couldn't pull himself together. Calmly picking up a glass of water from his bedside table, Kalyan asked her why she was there. He told her to just answer and leave, which infuriated the queen, causing her to bite her lip. She said that apparently, Kalyan had decided to accept a mentor, the seventh circle mage, Elon Manisil. As Kalyan finished his water, she added that the nobles were already starting to waver. The second prince, uninterested, asked what that had to do with him. The queen abruptly stepped closer to Kalyan, glaring, and told him that all the resources invested in him had better not be wasted. She ordered him to get ready immediately, as many eyes would be on him today. "So you had best not disappoint me," the queen stated, then left the prince's chambers. Kalyan seethed with anger at everything that was happening. He threw the glass in his hand to the floor. His servant, startled, cried out that he was bleeding. Blood dripped onto the floor as Kalyan, in a furious rage, yelled for them to leave, ordering everyone out immediately. The image of Kalyan's smiling face, eyes blazing red, flashed through his mind. The second prince burned with rage at the situation. The royal family paraded through the kingdom. The king, hailed by cheering crowds offering their congratulations, waved back with an air of grateful acknowledgement. The queen, seated within the carriage, simply observed the jubilant throngs. Following close behind were 3 elegant princes on horseback. A child perched on his father's shoulders was delighted to see all the princes present. His father remarked that the prince lagging far behind was the one he most wanted to see. It was Prince Kalyan, clad in a red suit that accentuated the beauty of his eyes. Kalyan's servant, leading his horse, prompted him with a question, his expression laced with concern. He inquired after the prince's health that day, adding that it was a relief to see his complexion much improved compared to the previous day. The prince smiled, explaining that he had rested well. He attributed this to the antidote he had taken the day before, which had significantly eased the pain in his heart. The servant noted the busy schedule ahead, the parade, the horseback riding, and then the ball. Kalyan replied that he needn't worry. He felt much better and could handle everything well. A hooded figure, concealed within the crowd and tucked away in an alleyway, watched the procession. Prince Baron noticed the figure, something about their presence catching his attention. He strained to identify them, as he had never seen them there before. His mind flashed back to the war that had nearly claimed his life, and he recalled the man who had saved him during that conflict. It was the same person standing in the alleyway before him. He was utterly shocked, wondering if it could truly be Care. Then the prince was certain it was Care. His horse, too, sensed the presence nearby. Baron wondered what Care was doing in Karis. The horse tried to move towards where Care stood, but the prince's servant held tight to the reins, preventing it from leaving the street. Baron urged him forward. The hooded figure turned and departed. The servant wondered if something was there. Baron simply watched the figure disappear, gently stroking his horse, trying to calm it. Then, with a smile, he spoke to the horse. "You felt it too, didn't you? But we can't go now," the prince concluded as the figure vanished from his sight. Kalyan then remembered the day of his past death. He recalled Care's smile as he sacrificed himself to save him. As the royal family paraded down the red carpet, a man came to greet them. It was Melford Prynne, the owner of the shopping center, who had prepared a horse-riding performance in place of the Roma family. Kalyan then thought that this had nothing to do with him, as thanks to this, he was caught up in a meaningless war of nerves. Then he remembered that it was during this horse-riding performance that Prince Randall was injured and Baron Poland was hanged on the same day. Meanwhile, Poland, smiling, cleared the way for the arrival of the royal family, showing them the seats he had specially prepared for them. The prince surveyed his surroundings, noticing the chandelier there. He remembered that this chandelier would fall on Prince Randall. He found it odd. With the king and the papal knights present, the guards hadn't inspected such a large item. The thought of the Knight Corps brought back the irksome image of Commander Kalyan. Kalyan, with a smirk playing on his lips, seemed lost in thought. As Poland guided them, Baron wondered if he should even offer Kalyan a chance to live. A servant informed Colin that he should call if he needed anything. Then, complaining of the chandelier's unsettling presence above him, Colin turned to leave, instructing Poland to inspect it. Poland, taken aback by the prince's request, simply stood there, gazing up at the elaborate fixture. Somewhat inexplicably, the equestrian display began. Horses and their skilled riders performed acrobatic feats. One man, hands clasped tightly, watched with mounting anxiety, the thought echoing in his mind that one day this burden would fall upon him. It was Poland, thrilled at his proximity to His Majesty. He had prepared extensively for this event and couldn't afford to miss the opportunity. Then, something behind him caught his attention. It was Prince Colin, looking somewhat bored by the entire spectacle. Poland remembered the prince's request to check the ropes. Ascending with the ropes in hand, Poland was startled by what he found. The ropes were indeed in a perilous state, frayed and near snapping. He shuddered to think what might have happened had the prince not warned him. What surely would have transpired would have certainly sealed Poland's fate. As he observed the prince, he couldn't help but wonder, how had he known about the ropes in the first place? Poland reasoned that the prince knew someone like him wouldn't pass up a chance to curry favor with the king. He was astute, able to read the situation and choose the most advantageous course of action, Poland concluded. Yet, he still wondered what made the Baron such a formidable foe in the eyes of the Roman family. Then he noticed the second prince. He was startled, for Prince Planche's gaze was fixed intently upon him. Meanwhile, Prince Planche simply stared at him with his usual look. Planche then told him to know his place, calling him an insect. All the while, the event announcer continued his boisterous commentary, oblivious to the tension. In the royal box, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. Planche declared that the scent of Calian's mother's filthy blood sickened him. Everyone heard Planche's words and was utterly shocked. It even caught the attention of the king, who usually paid little mind to the prince's bickering. The second prince appeared deeply shaken by Planche's words, but in truth, a wicked smile stretched across his face. Planche had spoken at the most opportune moment. He hadn't expected Planche to be so useful. The king then turned back to the front, leaving Celeste to deal with the fallout, curious to see how she would handle it. Behind her fan, which shielded her face, she was on edge. Remembering the time she had warned Planche before, she shot him a furious glance from the corner of her eye. The prince seemed remarkably calm throughout the ordeal, which surprised the queen. She suspected he had orchestrated the whole thing. On this day of all days, rumors spread like wildfire through the court. Prince Planche, it was whispered, had spoken treasonously to the king. Anxiety rippled through the assembled nobles. Since Corian had secured the loyalty of the mages, open support for Planche had dwindled, leaving Corian poised as the likely heir. The courtiers could no longer remain neutral. The time to choose sides was fast approaching. The performance concluded without further incident. Randall had averted disaster, and the king had refrained from publicly rebuking Planche for his recklessness and disrespect. Corian thought the incident would surely work in his favor. Seals, however, seemed strangely calm, considering her plan had utterly failed. Watching the queen, he wondered if she had orchestrated the entire affair. A memory from his past life flickered in his mind, a man asking his opinion of the accident he had just prevented. The Baron went on to suggest it might have been a plot to eliminate one of the three princes. What other reason could there be? He'd asked. The man hadn't answered. The man, his brother, had challenged him to a wager. The Baron had admitted to losing so many times he didn't even know how much he owed. As they played chess, his brother offered a hint, asking if the Baron thought the scene of the accident had been staged, as if to declare the royal family the target. The Melford Merchant Association was the second largest in Kelly's. Eliminating Melford would be incredibly advantageous for Renard Roman, head of the kingdom's principal merchant association. What is the Balin Merchant Association's most important business? The prince asked his attendant. They are known for their diamond mines, Ian replied. Then Corian had his answer. With Balin out of the picture, Roman could take over and control the diamond trade. The prince had initially intended to wash his hands of the matter after saving Balin's life. But now, he would make Roman pay for the trouble he had caused. Meanwhile, somewhere else, Bolin trembled with fear. He then instructed his attendant to cancel the rest of his schedule for the day, much to the attendant's surprise, as he couldn't possibly miss the ball. He feigned shock at Planche's audacity so that his attendant would do as he asked. That, he declared, was why he wouldn't be attending any events today. Meanwhile, the nobles were tidying up the palace and continuing the festivities. The king sat in his chambers, seemingly troubled. He was deeply disturbed and contemplative about all that had transpired. He recalled the mage's words. If he continued down this path, Calian would be only the first of many losses he would suffer. He also remembered Planche's words, how he'd found the scent of Calian's mother's dirty blood disgusting. Memories flooded the king's mind. Now, a red-haired woman was calling his name. It was Kalian's mother, once King Roman's wife. She lay on her deathbed. Someone rushed into the king's chambers, startling him. The noble announced that the queen requested an audience. The queen entered the room and approached the king. A maid, clearing away cups, mentioned she would prepare some tea for Her Majesty. The queen wondered if he had received a guest, as she hadn't been informed. The king raised his hand, signaling to his handmaiden that the tea would not be necessary. He added, as a final note, that the queen wouldn't stay long, a remark that did not please her. Then, Roman inquired as to what had brought Celeste there. After seating herself, she declared that House Roman would bear full responsibility for the incident, believing that she would lower herself by addressing Planche's blunder. She must have decided to prioritize her son's reputation. The king placed a hand on his chin, a gesture of deep thought, and asked responsibility. Has she lost her usual arrogance? She responded to the king, commenting that the day's parade had been impressive. She inquired whether Baron Poland should be rewarded for organizing such a delightful event. The king replied that she seemed to have given this a great deal of thought. She then unfurled her fan, once more shielding her face. She then stated that she, of course, intended to transfer the exclusive supplier rights to the Roman family's royal stables to him. A smile finally graced her lips. The king was taken aback, wondering if she would truly relinquish such a lucrative investment. He then recalled his conversation with Manasseh. Manasseh had said that the queen knew she had to give something up to mitigate the damage, but she was still not desperate enough to remove the knights she had placed within the palace. The mage continued, she will propose what she believes to be a fair reward. Once she does, indicate to her that your majesty is willing to turn a blind eye. The mage concluded. The king, crossing his legs, now looking much calmer, stated, tonight, Planche and I will enter the ballroom together. This greatly surprised, yet pleased the queen. With a smile, she said that he would be most pleased with this gesture. As agreed, Roman and Planche walked into the ballroom side by side, and Baron Poland was appointed the exclusive supplier to the royal stables. Everyone knew this was the result of Celeste's maneuvering to protect her son's reputation. The thought that the family would suffer such a blow, that the queen was paying for Planche's mistake, meant that Kalian was now a large enough threat to force the queen's hand. In Kalian's room, he and his servant, Enol, the room overflowing with gifts, he was stunned. He remarked, people certainly won't hesitate to switch sides. His servant inquired what was to be done with the gifts. The prince, simply satisfied to see Planche and House Roman lose influence, then replied that he wanted to prevent his hierarchy from being filled with traitors and told him to return everything except the gifts from the Arcane Enclave in Poland. As he walked out of the room, he told him not to forget to create a list of senders. As he was leaving, a particular gift caught his eye, a very large, very bright, jeweled necklace studded with red gems. This surprised not only the prince, but all the vassals in the room. He then asked if it was a horse necklace. He remarked that it was peculiar and asked Ian if anything was mentioned. He replied that he only said that the young master liked the raven. It was an unexpected gift. He wondered about jewelry for a horse and not for its owner. He believed he was being tested. Accepting the gift meant allowing him to repay a debt, and then he would send another treasure, this time to the prince, believing the favor fully returned. Then, with a smirk, the young man thought to himself that it wouldn't be that simple. He wouldn't be satisfied with just a gem. He told his servant, Ian, to find out how much the necklace was worth and send the money to Baron Poland, then asked if they should buy it. Prince Planche declared they would not, as it was one of kind. He gestured towards a carnivorous plant, stating the prize for originality should go to that. Ian took it to see who the gift was from, discovering it came from the Arcane Enclave. The prince remarked with surprise, mages and their aesthetic. His servant picked up a note and read aloud, explaining that it was rare and there were instructions included. It was a magical flower that, upon death, released bioluminescent pollen, popular amongst herbalists. At first, the prince seemed not to understand the reason for the gift, but then a thought struck him. He smiled, as if a puzzle piece had fallen into place. His servant then asked if he should send it back to the Enclave. The prince said no. They would keep it. A maid was tidying his room. The young man seemed to have an idea, and then Ian let out a yelp. It caught the maid's attention. In the background, Ian asked if everything was all right. He replied that yes, it just slipped from his hand. The teacup had fallen, spilling its contents across the floor. Ian told a maid to clean up the mess. While his clothes were being tended to, he noticed the tea had splashed onto the flour, partially covering it with the liquid. As a maid cleaned, Ian asked if this would harm the plant. The prince exclaimed loudly, "No, it's not like the tea was poisoned." The statement startled the maids. He told them to leave the pot where it was. He liked it there. Two figures rode on horseback, one thanking the other for taking time out of his busy schedule. It was the prince and Manasseh the mage. The mage said he couldn't refuse, and the young man was risking his life. The mage commented that he seemed much happier outside than in. The prince agreed. He'd started to say it was his first time, but amended his statement, saying he just wanted to have some fun. He needed to remember he was Callian, not Bolin. He asked the mage if he truly had his majesty's permission for this outing. The mage said the request should have reached him by now. Callian wasn't surprised by the mage's actions, considering himself just as culpable. He recalled sneaking away from Ian and going with the mage, who said he was his apprentice. The prince was pleased, saying he would take that as a compliment. Manasseh asked if he was taking the antidote regularly, and then Callian looked at the mage with a very serious expression, saying yes. Furthermore, he had taken his dose earlier that day and was feeling much better, so much so that the poisoner was starting to panic. Once they stepped into the trap, everything would come to light, the prince concluded. The mage said he admired his ingenuity. Perhaps he never needed him at all. The prince said that wasn't true. He said, smiling, that none of this would have been possible without the interesting gift the mage, Manasseh, had given him. As they reached a certain point in the kingdom, they stopped their horses, and the mage turned his horse around, facing the opposite direction. He said he would go that way, leaving Callian there. He thought he should go with his apprentice, but would allow Callian to do as he pleased. The prince then pulled up his hood, covering his head, and said he knew Manasseh would understand. Manasseh mentioned a magic shop on Tenantia Street, and hoped Callian would meet him there after he finished his errand. The prince spurred his horse forward, saying he would meet him there, and wished them both good luck. Then they headed in opposite directions. Then we see a very strong man forging a sword. The prince took the sword and held it up to his face. The sword reflected his red eyes. He rode away from there, thinking this should be enough. He sheathed the sword, finally saying he would make do with this one until his custom order was finished. Standing in a dark alley not far from the front of the blacksmith shop, he thought that from now on, he only needed information. The secret agency maintained a network across the continent to acquire information on other nations. However, these spies did more than just gather information. Each agent underwent years of rigorous training to become an elite assassin. And the one who established this network of assassins was King Debwan, the father of Byrne, who was the prince's previous life. He covered his face with his hood and walked forward into the dark alley, where he saw two men who appeared to be drunk. He was almost at the Pigeon Mail Center on Narasha Street. Callian knew how dangerous these assassins were, because the one who trained them was him. As the drunk men passed by the prince, he simply adjusted his hood so as not to be recognized. Now, as one of the princes of Kariz, if the assassins noticed his presence, they might try to kidnap him or do something worse. The black hair and red eyes were far too conspicuous. He knew the best course of action was to keep a low profile. Then he entered the Pigeon Mail Center, a fairly large place, apparently 2 stories high, with a lot of birds. As he walked through the place, he thought it was much bigger than it looked. Then, a young man who appeared to be a clerk asked him if he was looking for carrier pigeons, to which the prince replied that he wasn't. He said the birds weren't awake yet, which caught the attendant's attention. The man said they were the lethargic type. Callian said they must have flown a long distance, as they looked tired. The man said that was why they were sleeping. Callian, observing a bird that seemed to have a key shape on its back, said that was where the birds rested. The man then asked him what he was doing there. He promptly replied that he wanted bird feed. The man said he had come to the right place. But in the blink of an eye, the prince was attacked by the attendant, who had just sliced off a part of the young man's hood with a dagger. With the dagger against the back of his neck, he said he didn't remember selling any pigeons recently. Callian thought to himself, this man was no ordinary fighter. Callian wasn't physically prepared to face him. The prince placed his hand on the man's dagger, setting it down, and said, "It's clear you haven't sold any birds yet, seeing as you've just arrived in this kingdom." The man simply looked on, calm and serene. Birds referred to pies, bird feed to information. Secretion referred to espionage. Spies were to conceal their identities even from allies, lest their mission fail should they be captured. The man then asked whose spy he was. The prince gave a slight smile, maintaining his composure. He knew they couldn't possibly know, even if he used his father, King D-Bone's name, Nebularis, disguising himself as an intelligence spy. He then replied that he was Nebularis's man. The man was utterly shocked by his words. This made Kalyan the first Ceresian prince in history to spy on his own kingdom. He calmly stated that if things were settled, he wanted to acquire some information, as he had just left the nest. The man then opened a secret passage. He told the young man to follow him, and he led the way. As he intently watched the tunnel, the man said they would meet there often, and he could call him White Eagle. The young man replied that he could call him Red Swan. The man then said he would be sure to remember the name. They arrived at a place filled with books, and the man asked what kind of bird feed he was looking for. Burn said it was an item and a piece of information. The man then said it would cost 8 fire ants. He emphasized that payment was up front, which surprised the prince. Kalyan thought to himself that the man didn't even know what information he was looking for, and he wondered if he was trying to swindle him. The man answered even before he asked, saying they charged a flat fee, in case he was wondering. He then handed the young man an item and a piece of information. He picked up the paper, unfolded it, and began to read, asking if he was sure this was the correct location. White Eagle then said it was the only place that matched his request. The prince then thanked him for his help. Just as he was about to leave, the man told him to be careful. This caught his attention, as the man didn't seem like someone who cared about the well-being of others. The eagle then said it wasn't exactly the safest place. The prince then opened the door, agreeing with him. Of all the dangerous things in this place, I believe there is nothing more dangerous than you. White Eagle, Prince Burns thought to himself, and continued on his way, seeking the destination he had in mind. Near the bridge he had to cross, there was a group of people standing before it, and he wondered what they were doing there as he tried to pass unnoticed. But then his horse was startled by something. The prince tried to calm the horse, as it had no reason to be afraid. Then, a man from the crowd approached the young man. He said that the deceased were making their final journey, and if he wasn't in a hurry, he asked him to wait a while. The prince didn't understand what he meant by the deceased, but looking at the river, he realized it was a farewell ritual. He dismounted his horse, saying he could wait, and he didn't want to disturb the final journey of the deceased. Every nation had its own way of bidding farewell to the dead. Ceresians believed that souls departed this world with the red flowers on the river. It is said that in his homeland of Secretia, crossing a bridge as they pass by will cause souls to stray from their rightful path. We place flowers of woe upon the graves. In mourning the dead, the white petals of the flowers of woe wither as the sun rises and bloom purple beneath the night sky. They serve as a reminder that the living and the dead, like day and night, will forever be apart. This ritual offers solace to the people of Secretia as they bid farewell to their loved ones. Kalyan patiently waited for the people to finish their ritual. In his heart, he wondered if his brother, too, had placed a flower of woe upon his grave, or perhaps he had used the Arcus storm before that. The prince pondered. Then, it suddenly occurred to him that he might be a lost soul led astray. The man who had asked him to wait for the ritual to end thanked him for waiting until they were finished. Then the young man simply watched in silence. He mounted his horse, thinking that whatever had happened before, he was now the Prince of Ceres. Then he removed his hood and told the man that the souls could now rest. May they rest in peace. The man was startled to see his face. The prince then continued his journey, crossing the bridge. Meanwhile, as the man watched him leave, another person called out to him to finish the ritual. She asked him if anything had happened, and he said no. It was Arson, the high judge of Vulcan, the one who had caused Burn's death when he was still the prince of Secretia. He then removed his hood and told his companion that the person he had just spoken with seemed like a good man. Every shop I passed so far has had this name, Suspania. Burn stood before a tavern named Suspania and thought to himself. He remarked that it was truly unbelievable. In the end, those spies who always said that Ceres was crawling with Suspania followers weren't wrong. He entered the tavern, and a man welcomed him, saying he would find him a table. Then the young prince said there was no need. He said he had business on the 4th floor and gestured upwards. The man was then so surprised by his response that he agreed with a slight stutter and opened the door for him. The man then led the way for the prince, who followed closely behind. The man then opened a door, and wished him a pleasant time. Kalyan then entered a completely empty room with only tables and chairs. He then noticed an additional detail on the coat rack fixed to the wall. He then recalled the information he had bought from White Eagle, which was the location of the center of criminal activity in the royal capital. The active series. The prince grabbed the coat rack and turned it to the left, activating the mechanism. This mechanism opened a hidden door next to the coat rack. Asking to be taken to the 4th floor of this 2-story building was the code to get there, meaning the upper floors were merely a guise for a hidden basement. Descending the stairs, he continued to think about the place he was looking for. Not the casino on the 3rd floor with its small stakes, but the basement hidden deeper below. Then, the prince, Kalyan, approached a door and slowly opened it. Inside, men grappled fiercely with one another. It appeared to be a fighting pit, surrounded by a throng of spectators engrossed in the brutal spectacle. This was precisely where Kalyan intended to be. The crowd roared, urging the combatants to greater acts of violence, their bets placed on the more savage displays. The announcer's voice boomed through the clamor, declaring a victor. Gerald wins again. General payment slips will be distributed shortly, the announcer continued. Those who wagered on white, don't forget to collect your winnings. The loser, battered and broken, was dragged from the pit. The crowd showered him with curses. Kalyan, standing in the shadows, found the air thick with the stench of sweat and blood. The screams of men who have abandoned their humanity. What a sickening sight, he thought, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Amidst the chaos, a man approached Kalyan. "You forgot to pay," he said, catching the prince's attention. Kalyan, disguised and going by the name Baron, paid the man, who then summoned a server to escort him to table 27. A strikingly beautiful woman with vibrant blue hair and a scarlet dress approached. She took his arm, gesturing for him to follow, leaving him to wonder if she was perhaps mute. As she turned, Kalyan noticed her ears. He recoiled inwardly. They were mutilated. These clothes, they don't wear them willingly, he realized, his eyes falling upon the tracking collars around their necks. Lost in thought, the grim realization that they were constantly under surveillance settled upon him. The woman nudged him, drawing him back to the present. She pointed to herself, then to a tray, silently asking for his wager. Kalyan reached into his pocket, thinking he should probably play along. "I'll follow their rhythm until I get what I came here for," he mused, placing his money on the black side of the tray. In this place, the rules were simple. Bet on a fighter, and the winning side doubled their money. Bet 3, take 6. Bet 6, receive 12. Just as he'd won a substantial sum, the announcer declared the victor of the 10th match. Steel-legged Black Panther wins again. Payment slips will be distributed shortly. Those who wagered on black, don't forget to collect your winnings. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Baron's 3 fire coins transformed into 1536. Eyes fixed on the burgeoning pile of coins on the table, people whispered amongst themselves. "We're not here for the money," Kalyan, still thinking as Baron, thought grimly. The final match of the night, the announcer's voice boomed, laced with excitement, pays quadruple. That's right, it's the special match everyone's been waiting for. On the white side, we have the Hammer of Fury, Sean, and on the black side, the unshakable challenger. Kalyan, the unshakable challenger, was stunned. A memory flashed before his eyes. He saw the man, the challenger, saying he was once a fighter in the arena, forced to spill the blood of others for coin, until the death of his sister changed his fate. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer roared, "I present to you." The challenger, meanwhile, seemed to be warming up for the fight. "Do you wish to be a knight, Kalyan?" someone asked. He replied, "Not a knight, my prince, but a sword. My wish is to become your blade." He answered, placing his hand on his chest. Baron remembered his final moments, telling him to take up his sword and never give up. Then, Kalyan was announced in the ring, the announcer calling him Demon Eyes. The young prince immediately picked up his coins and placed them on the tray, shouting that he was betting all of his money on the black side. The server was shocked by his decision. Then, the whole place was stunned as he bet all of his money on that man, and people were asking if he was an idiot or completely insane. He just smiled, as if to say he knew what he was doing. Then the announcer shouted that Kalyan had 0 wins. He had yet to achieve victory in the arena. Would he change his record? Someone asked the young prince today if he was sure about throwing his money away like that. It was a large, blond man sitting a little further up front who turned around to reprimand the prince. The man told him to place his chips on the other fighter, because the man he was betting on had never won a single fight. Then Baron asked the server beside him if she had counted his chips yet. He confirmed his bet was on the black side again and asked her to verify. Then the man got a little angry, saying that he was just trying to warn him, as it wasn't his money. Hammer of Fury rarely lets his opponents leave unscathed, the announcer said, and the whole crowd shouted like crazy. Kallian watched the newcomer who had bet everything on him, warming up for the fight. His opponent said that another rookie gambler was going to starve because he bet on a stray dog who refused to quit the ring. The two warriors glared at each other, and the signal for the fight to begin was announced. Before their chains hit the ground, Kallian's opponent lunged at him with incredible speed. He immediately began attacking, and Kallian defended to avoid being hit in the head. As he defended, another wave of attacks came from the left, but he managed to block that one as well, protecting himself. The incredibly fast man said Kallian was too slow, kicking him in the stomach and sending him flying backward, making him spit out strawberry juice, while the crowd screamed for Hammer to finish him off. Baron couldn't believe what he was seeing, looking at the table angrily, thinking that Kallian was a punching bag without his sword. This should be easy for him. Why is he getting beaten? Baron asked. Kallian tried to throw another punch, but he was too slow for his opponent, who laughed at him. The man returned a heavy blow, telling him to give up. Hammer continued to relentlessly throw punches at him, and said that today was his end. As he prepared to deliver what seemed to be the final blow, Baron stood up from his chair, shouting Kallian's name, catching his attention. Then Baron yelled at him, just before the fist connected, to drop his shoulder. He heard what he said, but didn't understand why. Then, just as the fist was about to land, Kallian dropped his shoulder, dodging Hammer's heavy punch. He continued to lower his body, as if to gain momentum. He then prepared to throw a punch at his opponent. Baron was pleased he had dodged successfully and watched intently. Then Kallian landed a blow with all his might on Hammer's stomach. He kept hitting his opponent relentlessly. He landed a punch with immense force on Hammer's face, breaking his teeth. Hammer fell to the mat after Kallian's heavy blow. Everyone watching the match was stunned, as no one expected him to win the match. People then asked if everyone saw that, as it was like a phantom, because Kallian had defeated the dreaded Hammer of Fury. The announcer then declared his victory. All the bettors were furious with Hammer, as the vast majority had placed their bets on him. Looking at the crowd, he saw the one who had given him the tip to win the match. The young prince was overjoyed with his victory, but before he could even celebrate the win, a man came up behind him and told him to follow him. Baron then turned to the man, a tall, strong, dark-skinned man, who said someone wanted to talk to him. He followed the man, who led him to a room. Sitting on the sofa, the man who brought him there stood guard at the door and complimented him on making so much money with only 3 coins. The man at the door slowly drew his sword from its scabbard as the other man kept saying it was a lot of money. He gave a wicked smile, revealing his gold tooth, and said that a kid like him shouldn't be holding that much money. Baron then just gave a slight smile. He said the man didn't even have the courtesy to try negotiating and that he was dumber than expected. He told him with an angered expression to take off his hood, as he wanted a good look at him before he broke his nose. Holding his hood, he asked if the man was sure he wanted to do that. The prince said that the hood might be the only thing keeping him out of trouble. The man said he was dying of curiosity as he motioned for his men to come over and take it off. Then, his 2 henchmen, who looked like barbarians, approached the young prince. One reached for the young man's hood, telling him not to be shy, as they wanted to see the face he was hiding. Then, the hand reaching for the hood was quickly slashed by a blade. Holding a dagger, after hitting the man, Baron asked in their line of work, shouldn't people have quick reflexes? Where are your instincts? He asked the man. The man was scared, as Baron was very skilled with the dagger, and said he needed more time to prepare the money. Baron, skillfully holding the dagger, said the man could keep his gold. In exchange, he would take Kallian, pointing the dagger at the man. He said his master wouldn't be happy, as the guy was just starting to make a living. If you think I'll accept such a ridiculous offer, "You're mistaken," the man thought. "Maybe you can protect yourself in a fight, but we have the numbers here," he concluded as he looked at the young man. Meanwhile, Baron kept the dagger pointed at the man. The man said they wouldn't hand over Callian. Then he was startled by something flying towards him. His table was cut, and part of his pants were cut as well. The young man said he could keep his gold and his life. Baron, radiating mana and dagger in hand, asked if he now had his attention. The terrified man, desperate, asked if that was Sword Chi. He gestured to one of his followers, barking at him to leave and bring Carrie. Callian hoped he wouldn't have to do this again. As expected, Callian's body couldn't withstand the force of the aura. The follower sent to fetch Carrie returned, saying, there was a problem. The still pantsless proprietor demanded to know what the problem was. The follower explained that Carrie refused to leave Sheena behind. The name seemed to trigger something in Callian's memory. He then recalled a conversation he'd had with Carrie while still inhabiting Marcos's body. Marcos had said that when he left their home, his sister chose death. He admitted he had ultimately failed her. Callian clapped the proprietor on the shoulder and said he knew what to do. The proprietor then frantically shouted to bring the girl as well, but Callian said he wanted to go personally. The proprietor promised to ensure no one disturbed him along the way. Callian extended his hand. The proprietor didn't understand the gesture. He then told the man to return his 3 farns and the entry fee. With a sardonic expression, Callian stood by his horse, while Carrie and Sheena, slightly behind him, were just outside the establishment. Sheena appeared frightened, unsure of what was happening. Carrie then embraced Sheena protectively. He thanked Callian for rescuing him. Callian said nothing, only glancing sideways. Carrie mentioned he didn't know why Callian was helping them. Just then, something approached rapidly. In the blink of an eye, Callian removed his coat and draped it over Sheena, saying they could use it to relax their guard. He assured them he meant no harm. Carrie was startled when he saw the young man without his hood obscuring his face. Recognizing him as Prince Callian, he bowed his head slightly in apology, saying they should have recognized him sooner. Callian placed a hand on his shoulder, telling him to raise his head. He said they didn't need to bow before him. Penniless half-siblings, Callian could imagine their past in the previous timeline. Carrie hadn't been able to protect his sister. You tend to expose your shoulder in combat, a common habit for those who have just begun training with the sword. Do you wish to become a knight? Is that why you hone your swordsmanship? The prince inquired. Carrie replied that he didn't want to be a knight, but a sharp blade that protected everyone. The answer surprised the young man. He then handed Carrie his sword, saying that to become like that blade, he must act as a shield. This was his condition for teaching him swordsmanship. He should seek him out when he made his decision. Carrie asked why he was being so kind to them. With a faint smile, he said he needed a sharp blade, but in his eyes, this was the least he could do to thank his old comrade. Meanwhile, on Tiananmen Street, everything was deserted due to the late hour. Located, there was the office of the Mage Association. The mage dispatched to observe the cavalry performance reported the following. The prince is worried about Poland and told us to keep a close eye on him, the Red-Mane Poland. Poland found a severed rope at the last banquet. He burned the letter as he read it. As the letter burned, he watched, wondering how his apprentice could have known all this. Then the prince, Callian, arrived, drenched in sweat, his clothes rumpled. A smile touched his lips as he announced his arrival with a casual air. The mage looked him up and down. Assessing his condition, the mage inquired, "Your Highness, have you been in a brawl?" Callian sat down, replying that a few unforeseen incidents had occurred. As the mage went to prepare tea, Callian remarked that it seemed the younger man had had a busy day. "It's been a long one," he admitted, stretching. "I acquired some information and also set a trap at Dorsey's company." He continued to stretch as he spoke. Callian wondered why the mage seemed so concerned. If it were just him, he'd be impressed by how much he'd accomplished in such a short time. The mage simply watched him as he prepared the tea. Callian watched, fascinated, as the mage brewed the tea, the entire process orchestrated through magic. He had finally made it to the mage's office. Noticing his excitement, the mage asked if he'd been expecting some kind of magical potion with eyeballs in it. Callian replied that it was something like that. After answering, his gaze fell upon a dull dagger resting on the table. "Doesn't quite fit the decor," he observed. He took a closer look at the dagger. Something about it caught his attention. It was the dagger he had acquired earlier. A note of surprise entered the mage's voice. "How did your dagger end up here, Your Highness?" he asked. "It shouldn't be there." Suddenly, the dagger levitated, startling Kalyan. It shot towards his chest. It nearly struck him. He knew it was too late to dodge. The mage simply watched, arms crossed. Even with that frail body, you're quite fast, the mage commented. Kalyan had managed to deflect the blow using the aura surrounding his own dagger. Before it clattered to the floor, the dagger flew back. A magical artifact created by the Suspanians, the mage explained, holding it up. It reveals a replica of an opponent's hidden weapon. A warning, wouldn't you say? The mage asked. Kalyan was breathless. Using his aura was always taxing. It was supposed to be a simple test. He'd overreacted, done something unnecessary. How is it unnecessary if you don't even know how to properly hold a sword? The mage questioned. Kalyan simply sat on the sofa, hand clutched to his chest, trying to catch his breath. The mage placed a hand on his shoulder. The day we first met, our meeting didn't go as planned, Your Highness, he said, but I knew things were starting to get strange. He revealed records of his conversations with the king, noting the noble surprise at Kalyan's transformation. He then showed a record of a conversation with the queen. When you discovered you were poisoned, he continued, you showed more of a will to survive than a fear of death. That kind of feeling could only belong to someone who has already shed a lot of blood. Furthermore, he added, you already knew about the accident that would occur during the cavalry exhibition. The mage paused. Can you explain all of this to me, Your Highness? Kalyan felt his body recovering more quickly, thanks to the healing magic. As he healed, he wondered if the mage suspected him, but he believed the mage simply wanted to trust him. Then, slapping his hand on the table, he declared, I am not Kalyan, and his real name was Barn Secretia. The two of them sat facing each other. The mage asked him, before anything else, to tell him if the real Prince Kalyan was dead. He shook his head in denial, saying that wasn't quite the case. At first, he had his doubts, but later he became certain Kalyan was still alive. He could feel his presence. The mage then recalled that on the day they met, Kalyan had said the throne wasn't what he desired, so he asked him what he did want. Baran calmly replied that he wanted to stop the war. He still didn't understand why Kaylee wanted the timeline. If there was any remaining reason, everything would repeat itself. He wanted to find out the reason behind it. The mage then calmly asked, was what he wanted chasing after the rightful heir, or was it something beneficial to Baran? Baran didn't understand the question and asked him what he meant. The mage replied that before anything else, Baran needed to know something. Currently, Secretia only had Prince Chase. The problem was, he was the son of a concubine, yet the queen couldn't bear children. Baran couldn't possibly exist here. The mage finished his explanation, leaving Kalyan utterly astonished. Baran felt an overwhelming emptiness and confusion. Lost in thought, he wondered if he might not exist, whether in Secretia or anywhere else. Kalyan was immersed in his own thoughts and fears. He wondered why this was happening and how it had happened. Kalyan was in good physical condition. He said that deep down he felt something. The prince said that sometimes he wondered if someone had entered Kalyan's body, just as he had entered Kalyan's. As long as I live, there won't be another Baran. The young man seemed saddened by the whole story. He knew that even so, it was no different from stealing someone else's life. Then the mage tried to explain the situation in Secretia, saying that Chase was the sole heir to the throne. You should know that the past is not the same as the present, and the future may have already been changed. All three princes of Kairos are in mortal danger. Unlike your prince in Secretia, who grew up in the company of his best friend, the mage stated. The mage had a serious look on his face, while Kalyan looked surprised. He said that this meant they shouldn't dwell on the past. He decided to clarify things with the mage, saying that what he feared wouldn't happen. The moment he opened his eyes on the first day he arrived in Kairos, he gave up on living as Baran. These words greatly surprised the mage, as he hadn't expected this. Kalyan asked the mage if he was truly all right with all of this. Even if he wasn't the crown prince of Kairos, the mage said with a smile, there was nothing to worry about. He could assure him that from the very beginning, there was only one person he connected with. The priests had already mounted their horses. Baran wondered if the mage knew Aku's Tempest from Stoke, so he decided to ask him if he knew a lot about the timeline. The mage simply maintained his serious expression, riding alongside Kalyan. He began to say that last year, during the same month, Prince Chase had come to him, asking for advice about the timeline. He infiltrated the secret vault, but found nothing other than the Axis not being man-made. Last month, he received a letter from the vault regarding the Axis's disappearance, which coincided with the time Baran claimed to have returned to 10 years prior. Baran was shocked that he had returned to the same period when the Axis vanished from timeline. Perhaps, Baran suggested, that was the reason for its disappearance. Before he could elaborate, the mage interrupted, stating that even though this was a significant issue, they still lacked answers. However, he added there was someone they could ask, someone who knew more than the mage and would soon meet with Prince Chase. This individual was the Suspanian they had spoken of earlier. Prince Chase agreed with the mage's decision. His ascension ceremony was fast approaching. This ceremony, held whenever a new member joined the Suspanian royal family, was where everyone would come to understand the will of Suspania. The mage urged him to focus on surviving until the ascension ceremony, to strive and do what must be done. Baran might have said that even if he couldn't, the seeds he had sown had already begun to sprout in his room within the palace. His servant expressed worry over the prince's recent absences. The prince examined the plant he'd received from a mage, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The servant suggested he wash his face before bed. A smile played on the prince's lips. "Do you want to see something cool?" he asked. They then proceeded to the palace terrace. The early morning air was crisp and cold. "The plant we received as a gift from the Mage Association is incredibly rare," he began. "Its properties are not widely known. That day, I pretended it was an accident. While no one was looking, I sprinkled poison into the flower pot. I observed the servant's reaction during that time. A normal person wouldn't survive 7 days with this poison, let alone a plant. Yet this plant is still alive, as if someone deliberately swapped it." The prince stood lost in thought on the terrace. Then something caught his eye, something shimmering intensely. He was struck by the magnitude of the light. A brilliant trail arced across the palace courtyard. If they swapped it, he mused, disposing of the flower pot wouldn't be easy. "I must have put it somewhere safe. That way, he'll know the truth," Prince Chase, the master of the Hishia Palace, concluded. Prince Messalis, he thought, just wait for me tomorrow. In East Draini watched the rain fall through the window. Then, someone entered his room. He turned to see who it was. It was Ian, bringing tea and bidding him good morning. The prince inquired about Ian's sleep. Callian seemed to be in excellent spirits, his face bright and cheerful. Slightly surprised, Ian confirmed he had slept well and asked if His Highness had also rested, placing the tea tray on the table. He remarked that it was unusual for the prince to ask about his sleep first. The young man admitted to waking up early that day. Ian replied that it was a good thing, as the sun would rise from the west today. The prince picked up his teacup and took a sip. As Prince Chase sipped his tea, Ian inquired if the sound of the rain had woken him. "It's subtle," Ian continued, "but I can still sense it. You've increased the dosage of the poison, Your Highness." Cyrus, the prince's other attendant, watched them both. Chase asked Ian if there were any events scheduled for the following week that all the nobles would attend. His servant replied that a council meeting was planned and all nobles, including His Majesty the King, were expected to be present. The prince knew that a week after the council meeting, a banquet would be held. That day, he realized, would be the perfect opportunity to test the poison's efficacy. So, Messalis, Chase thought to himself, enjoy yourself while you still can. He then picked up the small vial containing the pills the mage had given him. With a swift, almost casual movement, he swallowed one of the pills as if it were sweet. He handed the empty teacup back to Ian, who then posed a question. Ian inquired whether the prince had been eating properly these past few days. He had been informed that Chase had only been consuming nutrient solutions. The prince closed a small pouch containing the pills. Feigning weakness, he said, "I feel rather faint today," and requested to go down for breakfast. Ian agreed and went to assist His Highness with dressing. The servant was surprised that the prince had finished all of his tea. He wondered why the prince was already at the breakfast table so early and seemed so concerned. After the incident at the theater, Prince Messalis hadn't come down for breakfast. Chase thought it was for the best. It wouldn't interfere with his plans. As the first prince sipped his wine, Callian mentioned that the roses would be blooming soon. Randall reacted with surprise to this seemingly innocuous comment, glancing sharply at Callian. Callian simply smiled, and their eyes locked for a brief moment. Randall abruptly rose from the table and left without finishing his meal. In a low voice, Ian asked if the prince thought mentioning roses at breakfast was a little out of place. Chase replied that he had seen some flowers in the hallway, and it had reminded him of the way Randall cared for his roses. His servant commented that it didn't quite make sense. The young prince simply continued with his breakfast. Later, Prince Chase trained in the castle gardens under the falling rain. Drenched, sweat mingling with the rainwater, he leaned against a tree, breathless and exhausted. Someone approached, commenting that he looked worse each day, and asked what he was doing. The prince replied that it would be difficult to improve if he constantly avoided physical training. The person there was his master, who had appeared unexpectedly. The mage said he was speaking with Lemian. The prince was surprised he used his given name so casually. The mage said it was nothing special, just an ordinary name. He asked the prince why he had summoned him. Callian replied that he wanted to ask two things. The first was that he needed two identities. The mage said he could arrange that easily. The prince said the second matter was that he wanted to investigate the deaths involving the nobles, particularly those connected to Roman. Both of them wore a slight smile. The mage said that wouldn't be a problem either, and that he was lenient with his apprentice. However, he asked if it was urgent. The prince replied that the dosage of the poison had been increased, and that he believed he had identified the culprit. The mage said he already had an idea who it might be. The prince mentioned that they would soon start putting pressure on the mage. It's difficult to find a truly great mage, but the master needs an ace in the hole, Manhwa concluded. He then asked if Baron intended to use the mage as a distraction. Baron's gaze hardened. Not as a distraction, he stated firmly, but as a weapon. Yes, a weapon. I know the power of mages better than anyone. They're the ones who slaughtered my people in my own country. An army of mages, the White Demons. He finished with a decisive statement. I will forge a mages association loyal to me. Manhwa was taken aback by the young prince's declaration. Mages aren't like knights, he argued. They're born, not trained. There are things I haven't told you, Baron countered, and this worked in the previous timeline. This piqued the mage's interest. When King Roman first expressed his desire to establish his own mages association in Kyrus, everyone, including Roman's nobles, laughed. The idea was quickly dismissed, but thanks to that, the king managed to initiate the plan, without attracting public attention. Although it only bore fruit shortly after the Mages Association was consolidated. Roman died under suspicious circumstances. After the king's death, the association swore allegiance to his heir, Prince Callian, and became a force for peace in his conquests, as you already know. But now I won't allow that to happen so easily, the prince declared. The young man knew he had to tread carefully, as Roman's faction would try to thwart his plans. My trump card, Baron revealed, is the poison tea that Chase has been giving to Messalis. The mage didn't understand what the young prince meant. A smile played on Baron's lips as he asked, would Callian care to share the details? The young man replied that he would find out soon enough. Disappointed with the answer, the mage suggested, perhaps you should speak with the king. I suspect he has much on his mind. The prince reassured him, saying the mage needn't worry. Chase is bound to make a mistake and will be forced to negotiate. We must seize that opportunity to gain the upper hand. We are administering more poison, as per his majesty's orders, a maid servant reported, slamming her hand on the table. The queen declared she wouldn't tolerate any mistakes. Rumors were spreading amongst the populace, and this narrative didn't suit her. Or should I continue to face this inconvenience? The queen asked, her voice laced with menace. Her maid quickly responded, no, your majesty. As they conversed at the dining table, a man approached. The queen continued, when my disobedient son refuses to fulfill his duties, I have no choice. The man who approached the queen was Prince Chase. He looked furious. You're interfering, mother, he stated. I'm only here to tell you that. The queen retorted, your opinion is irrelevant in this matter, as you've done nothing to secure your own future. She added dramatically, unfortunately, this is the pain of motherhood. If I must sacrifice everything for my son, then so be it. Chase clenched his fists in anger. He abruptly turned his back on his mother and stormed away. Sipping her tea, the queen muttered, he's weak, and he will have no rivals on his path to the throne. Then, the day of the move arrived. It was a beautiful day, and someone was humming a tune. Someone's in a good mood. You've been singing all day. Are you that excited? Ask Kyrie, one girl teased. We're finally going to the royal palace. That means we get to see Prince Chase again, Sheena replied, a blush warming her cheeks. Kyrie, Her eyes twinkling, asked, "Do you like him?" Sheena giggled, "He's amazing. I can't wait for tonight." Meanwhile, within the opulent walls of Hishia Palace, the royal tailor and his assistants bustled around Prince Chase, making minute adjustments to his elaborate attire. Ian, Chase's ever-attentive servant, oversaw the final touches, ensuring every detail was perfect. He informed the prince that he was expected at the banquet in an hour. Chase, his gaze distant, replied, "I need you to do something for me, Ian." The young prince mused to himself. It was time to end the charade. The weakest, the youngest, had been subtly coerced into drinking the poisoned wine, succumbing one by one. But now, he would refuse the drink himself, gracefully, politely, and without suspicion. As Chase entered the grand banquet hall, the herald announced his arrival. His eyes met his mother's, the queen, for a fleeting moment. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. It was time for the next phase of his plan. Meanwhile, Ian spurred his horse onward, the prince's request weighing heavily on his mind. Chase had entrusted him with 2 letters, one for the Arcane Enclave and the other from Master Allen. He was to deliver the letter to the Enclave first, before visiting Allen. The prince had reassured him, saying he would be fine, that everything would go according to plan. A flicker of anxiety danced within Ian. This wasn't the first time Chase had undertaken such clandestine maneuvers. He pushed the worry aside, chiding himself for his needless concern. Back in the opulent banquet hall, a sudden crash echoed through the room as a wine goblet shattered on the marble floor. The startled guests gasped, the king most of all. Someone collapsed before the queen. As chaos erupted in the palace, the scene shifted to the Arcane Enclave. A woman with vibrant purple hair addressed Manhwa, informing him that all the records he had requested were compiled. The official documents themselves are quite the read. The woman, Yulia Saren, head of the Silesian Arcane Enclave, remarked. Manhwa, his brow furrowed in thought, replied, "But to think such a significant matter was kept from the public. I suppose the nobles didn't have much choice. The lesser families wouldn't dare oppose House Roman," Yulia concluded, her voice laced with a hint of disdain. "Not if they wanted to avoid unfortunate accidents befalling them." She paused, her curiosity piqued. "Do you know why Prince Chase wants this information?" Manhwa considered his response, but before he could answer, the door burst open. Someone called out for Lady Yulia. It was Ian, breathless from his frantic ride. Relief washed over him as he saw both intended recipients present. He handed Prince Kalian's letter to Manhwa. Then, as the mage began to read, he presented the other letter to Yulia. Manhwa shot to his feet, grabbing his cloak. "Where is the banquet being held tonight?" he demanded. Ian, startled by the mage's abruptness, stammered, why are you suddenly going?" "You'll need an invitation." Yulia's voice cut through the air, sharp with urgency. "There's no time. Kalian's life is in danger." Ian stared at her, bewildered, then at the letter in Manhwa's hand. The mage's words suddenly made chilling sense. The letter revealed Kalian's perilous plan. Tonight, he would risk his life to force Ceres to negotiate. If things went wrong, he was counting on the mage to save him. Just an hour before all this unfolded, Kalian sat across from the queen, sipping tea. "I suggest we drop the charade," he stated, his voice low. The queen snapped her fan shut, a glint in her eye. "Agreed." Tapping her fan against the table, the queen remarked that it made little difference. Kalian, maintaining his composure, calmly sipped his tea. "He asked for the mask to be removed, not for your courtesy to be discarded," Kalian said, his gaze fixed on the queen. "A war of words is the best you can muster." "I had expected to be surprised," the queen retorted. Rising to her feet, the queen declared she had expected more and regretted wasting her time. She added that a commoner like him would never understand the courtesy of entertaining a guest. Kalian simply stated that he knew about the poison. He placed his cup on the table, saying he felt he'd had enough and couldn't imagine ever acquiring a taste for it. The queen, momentarily taken aback, fainted back into her chair. "What do you mean?" she asked, bewildered. Smiling, she commented that his jest hadn't landed as intended. Kalian told her not to worry, as he had come prepared and had other ways of sharpening his weakened mind. "I wondered what risk I should take to ensure your compliance," he mused, producing a small vial. "My only possession of value is this strong heart, so I decided to risk it," the prince declared, displaying the vial. He explained that the substance within could briefly stop the heart. The queen leaned back against the table as he spoke. The prince continued, explaining that neither silver spoons nor magical catalysts could detect the substance, and antidotes were useless against it, as his heart was protected by the blessing of Suspania. But since the blessing can only mitigate one affliction at a time, drinking the poison tea here would allow your poison to spread through my body and kill me. If I die alone in your company, who do you think will be held responsible? The prince inquired. The queen's face twisted into a sneer. She let out a sharp laugh directed at Callian. Do you think you can threaten me with this? She scoffed. You shouldn't assume you're the first enemy I've faced in this manner. She continued. The whole world knows I killed Callian's mother, yet they chose silence. So what makes you think this time will be any different? Infuriated by her words, the prince demanded, what should I do then? The queen, a cruel smile playing on her lips, told him to do whatever he must. The prince, accepting her challenge, drank the tea. He drained the cup in one gulp. The queen watched, a wicked smile fixed on her face. Fool, she hissed. Who would dare blame me? Even Roman himself couldn't bend me to his will, the queen gloated. There's nothing in Sekarisha I can't have, including the queen's throne. Over time, I removed the obstacles in my path and soon gained everything I desired. But there's one more thing that is rightfully mine, the queen thought, her gaze fixed on the king, just as the announcement of the banquet's commencement began. A cough echoed through the hall. The queen simply watched, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. He's the last one, she thought. Prince Callian then collapsed, strawberry juice splattering from his lips. Everyone at the banquet, shocked by the sudden turn of events, leaped to their feet. Screams erupted, calling for a priest. Behind her fan, the queen seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the chaos. Callian lay at her feet, everyone in a panic, the air thick with questions. Was the drink poisoned? Had he been poisoned before the banquet? And with whom had he been before the banquet? Just then, a voice demanded silence if they didn't want to die. The queen felt a surge of triumph. No one dared accuse her. The king rushed to Callian's side. He cradled the prince, begging him to stay with him. To the king's astonishment, Callian then called him father. The memory of the day Callian's mother, Freya, died flooded back. She had made him promise to protect their son. Callian tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He could only point. The king seemed to understand. The queen, feigning shock at the disgraceful scene, declared she couldn't bear to stay a moment longer and would return to the seasoned palace. Holding his son close, the king's voice trembled with rage. How dare you do this to our son? He roared, his voice echoing through the hall. Queen Celise. A wave of shock rippled through the room. No one had expected this. The queen turned to the king, the look in her eyes no longer one of feigned innocence, but stark surprise. Whispers erupted, recalling how the two had been together earlier. Some wondered aloud if the queen had poisoned him. Others murmured that they wouldn't be surprised if she had. The queen gripped her fan tightly. Hiding behind her fan, she claimed he didn't know what he was saying. Has he perhaps been suffering from chronic illness? She asked, her voice laced with false concern. The king, his fury barely contained, reminded her that she and all the knights had been present when Freya died. He repeated the same words she had used then. She died of an illness, she had said. Celise, even if that were true, you are responsible for this. The king thundered. Who can guarantee he has always been healthy? The queen retorted. No one here will believe you. A smirk played on her lips as she continued. Perhaps the princes who share breakfast with him every day know the state of Callian's health. Perhaps you should ask them, she suggested, her voice dripping with malice. Silence, the king commanded. With mock concern, she replied, I'm merely worried that amidst this chaos, our son's condition will only worsen. The king, enraged, drew his sword. How dare you say our son? A voice from the crowd echoed the sentiment. Of all people, she shouldn't say that. The queen's expression shifted dramatically. Plant spoke up. Callian was fine. I never sensed anything wrong with him, at least not since the last time we met. The queen rounded on Planche, her fury palpable. Just then, the doors burst open, and a voice announced the arrival of the priest. Seizing the opportunity, the queen retreated to the seasoned palace. The king implored the priest to heal his son. But as the priest began to weave his healing magic, a protective barrier shimmered into existence around the prince. A figure stepped forward, halting the priest's spell. It was the mage, Manhwa, arriving breathless and sweating. She wants him dead, he declared. Kill him, Manhwa urged. The king, bewildered and furious, demanded to know what the mage was doing. Callian needs urgent treatment. There's a circle in the prince's heart, Manhwa revealed. If a mage's magic circle comes into contact with divine power, no matter how fortunate, the heart will explode and the person will die. Callian coughed violently. King Salih sat on the floor and asked, if divine power doesn't work, what should we do? Can magic be used? The mage, Manhwa, replied, if it were a healer with the power of nature, perhaps, but with magic, it's impossible. The king urged him to find a solution quickly, as the prince was in agony. Manhwa then recalled a moment in his life, a scene he had witnessed that had terrified him deeply. A man knelt on the ground, blood trickling from his mouth, much like Callian now. The man had asked him why he was in this state. Manhwa reached out and cradled Callian's head. He sat on the floor, placing Callian's head in his lap. The prince looked up at his attendant's face. Callian's vision blurred slightly as he asked, why do you have that expression? Manhwa thought to himself, I never thought I would use this spell again in my lifetime. In his mind, he recalled using magic on that man from his past. He had told the man, this magic will take away your pain, calling him stubborn. Days passed, and people walked the streets as normal. A couple strolled down the street when a leaf flew by and struck the man's face. Startled, he looked up at the sky and saw many other leaves falling as well, demanding the truth behind the Brezin family, who had murdered 37 people, be revealed. The Brezin family found themselves caught in a storm. The suspicion of Queen Salih attempting to poison Callian, along with the Brezin family's cruel acts, became public knowledge, igniting the fury of the people. No one could have any association with the Brezin family, for if they made a mistake, they too could be swept up in the chaos. King Salih himself accused Queen Salih of the poisoning. Enraged at the thought of their queen being a murderer, the people wrote on the walls of the kingdom, destroy Queen Salih. Mage Manhwa said, the prince mentioned that in order to establish a mage order, we need to use the time when Salih is the focus of attention. The king, reading what appeared to be a letter written by the prince, fell into deep thought. He was astonished, for Callian shared the same thoughts as him, to create a mage order. Later, at Callian's bedside, Queen Salih said, the Mage Association must be busy. When did you manage to prepare such a thing? She hid her face behind her fan. Callian feigned ignorance, saying he didn't know what she was talking about. I could use some rest, the prince said. Thanks to her, he added, which angered her. As for someone hovering between life and death, he was doing rather well. He continued, I almost crossed over to the other side. Gasping, sweat beading on his brow, he said, because of that, if there's nothing else, it will be difficult for us to have a long conversation. The prince concluded, I will rest now. Queen Salih asked nervously, what do you think about us negotiating one by one? Callian replied, you should have said that a week ago. The situation has changed now. But, he conceded, I will listen to what you have prepared to say. The queen then said, if you declare these accusations to be false, I will not object to your preparations. The prince burst into laughter at her words, replying that he believed she misunderstood. The queen, her face a mask of fury, hid behind her fan. He didn't need her permission or anything of the sort, the young man stated, and asked if she had nothing better to do. The queen gripped her fan so tightly her knuckles whitened. Rising to her feet, she pointed a finger at Callian, telling him to say what he wanted to say with a smile on his face. He obliged, asking how the sound of clashing steel could ring so loudly in a land ruled by a descendant of Suspania. He concluded, to disband Pable's knight force. This left the queen utterly shocked. Disband them all, she questioned, incredulous. Pable was the royal knight order gifted to Salih by the Marquis of Brisson. Losing them meant Salih would lose half her power. He had no choice, Callian told her, but to disband Pable and begin forming a mage order. The queen bristled at his audacious demand. The prince then summoned his servant, who brought forth some documents and presented them to the queen. This is a testimony with a vow seal, Ian explained, handing the papers to the astonished queen. Her surprise at the mention of the vow seal prompted the prince to explain. It was a form of magic, he said, that carved the contents of a contract onto each other's hearts. If the vow was broken, the heart would be destroyed, followed swiftly by death. Queen Salih had gone to see Callian as soon as he awoke. Meanwhile, the first prince was in his garden, tending to his roses. He noticed a fallen bloom on the ground and grew contemplative. His mind drifted back to the moment Callian collapsed. Just before he fainted, their eyes had met. He also remembered his brother mentioning at breakfast that the roses would bloom soon. Callian had wanted him involved, he realized, curious to see how these roses would unfold. He considered acting on Callian's wishes. As the prince collapsed, Randall had been about to speak, but Planche had spoken first, claiming Callian had always been well. Randall had been surprised. It was Planch who had intervened to help the prince. He knew things were definitely changing. Back in Kalian's room, he was explaining to the queen how the vow worked. It was a magic that carved the contents of the contract onto their hearts. If the vow was broken, their hearts would be destroyed and death would be instantaneous. Given that the trust between them wasn't particularly strong, the prince continued. He asked what she intended to do. The queen remained silent, seemingly taken aback. The queen snatched the pen from Kalian's servant's hand and began to sign the oath. As she signed, a magical aura began to emanate. By the time she finished, the magic enveloped her arm. The contract was complete, binding their hearts. The queen threw the pen to the ground in a fit of anger, snapping it in two. As she turned to leave, Kalian told her not to misunderstand. He'd never had a good relationship with his brothers, he continued, and Planch hadn't intervened for his sake on the day he was poisoned. If she had said one more word then, the king's sword would have taken her head. The image of a plant sprang into Queen Selisa's mind. She seemed surprised by Kalian's words. Composing herself with the air of a strong woman, she quickly left Prince Kalian's room. He simply watched her go. A while later, Manhwa, the mage, went to the prince's room, saying he was shocked to hear Selise had visited him. Someone was apparently eating a lot of bananas. The mage felt a little relieved, as it seemed Kalian was just hungry. Kalian, devouring the bananas, commented on how delicious they were. Manhwa remarked that anything would taste delicious after nearly dying. The prince chuckled, saying he'd done his part. Manhwa was annoyed he could still laugh, considering he could have been visiting the prince's grave. He said they were incredibly lucky the elf siblings had appeared at that critical moment. The girl, Sheena, was a healer who wielded the power of nature. The mage said he could have died, and the prince expressed surprise, unaware that Sheena was a healer. Manhwa asked if he'd known in his previous life. The young man replied that back then, he'd only had contact with Carrie. She had already passed away when he met her. The mage received the answer without even needing to ask the question. He was furious that Kalian had taken the poison without any survival plan, relying solely on the power of a blessing. As Kalian apologized, the mage tossed a piece of paper at him. It was the identification papers for the children that he had requested earlier, which the prince had almost forgotten. Something caught the prince's eye, and he looked surprised. The siblings' last name was Byron. The mage explained they needed a surname, so he used his old one, as it seemed no coincidence he had brought them there. Kalian looked at the papers very carefully, smiling and thanking the mage. He then commented that they weren't fake, but legitimate identification, and Manhwa confirmed they had been registered as people of the Burns territory from the start. The mage revealed that Roman had done it, which surprised the prince. Manhwa asked how he felt about the rumors that he was now the king's favorite son. Kalian questioned if such rumors truly existed. The mage replied that since the king had acted that way in front of all the nobles, of course, there would be rumors. The prince felt conflicted, saying it was something others should be feeling. He sat on the sofa, deep in thought about the whole situation. Kalian called for Ian to clear the banana peels from the table. His servant called out to him, standing before him and looking at him. He said he had something to tell the prince, who asked what it was. Ian declared that he wanted to stop being his aide. The prince was utterly shocked by these words, completely unexpected. Small feet padded against the carpet. A young boy ran through the opulent halls of the palace, thick pillars flanking him on either side. In the background, on the second floor to the left, he ran towards his intended destination. He looked past the wooden banister and called out, announcing his presence. Before him, a pale man lay in bed, his hands visible, wrapped in bandages. The boy, a smile gracing his lips, greeted his brother, who responded in a low murmur. "Did you hear the crickets chirping this morning?" The boy asked his brother. "Crickets? Yes, when summer begins, those dreadful black insects start screeching madly," the man replied melancholically. The boy, with greater optimism, remarked, "Crickets have strange wings, but perhaps they make that loud noise inside themselves, with their bellies." He suggested catching one such insect the following morning and bring it here. The brother, bandaged from head to toe, said he shouldn't and mentioned his dislike for crickets, urging him to simply play the violin. "I heard your son is quite skilled in medicine," the man said. "He said he's busy with other things. How could I ask him to do this?" The unsettling words reached the boy's ears. "But, sir, this truly grieves my heart as well. But there must be another way," another man pleaded. "I didn't know then that the words 'what one cannot have' would be so terrifying." Saluyan, the brother called to the boy. Don't look away. Look into my eyes. Understand that I am dying, his brother said, staring intently. A loud shriek echoed. We need to escape, they cried. Get Saluyan out of here. The fire is spreading quickly. This was how his brother, the day before his 15th birthday, chose to end his pain and theirs. After that, summer passed, autumn arrived, and was replaced by winter. Then the crickets began to chirp again in the garden, and he shut himself away ever more deeply. His father, unable to bear his suffering, carried him from a room where he always locked himself away, his head resting on his father's shoulder. What manner of boy is this? He suddenly asked. This is the third prince of our kingdom, he said, cradling his head in his hands, consumed by grief. A young man with reddened eyes was overcome with sorrow. Saroyan saw that the prince's heart was heavy. I wish to resign as your servant, he said, looking timidly at Kalyan. Kalyan stared back, shocked. No, what are you saying? He asked. Ian, weeping aloud, began to tell the story. She was the closest person to the prince, yet she didn't understand what was happening. Not only that, but she was the one who delivered the poison every morning. He looked at the stunned servant. It's all my fault for ignoring the things that troubled me, and for not even being able to be by your side when you were in danger. I knew nothing, and you almost died again, Ian said. Ian saw the face of his dead brother. Don't ignore the fact that I'm dying, he said, as if from another world, and reached out his hand to Ian. Ian, look at me, the prince called out sharply. Then his servant opened his tear-filled eyes as if awakening. Who stands before me now? The prince then asked. He could see in his eyes that he was waiting for an answer. It's Prince Kalyan, Ian said, weeping. Then Kalyan placed his hand on Ian's chest and said that he would not die. From the moment I first opened my eyes here, you've been by my side. Thanks to you, I've held on until now. I survived because you looked after me. I don't seem to know much about you either, but I'm sure of one thing. You'll continue to protect me from now on, right? Go and ask the prince. Ian, Kalyan's servant, deeply moved by these words, knelt down and wept. Stop that, get up. Kalyan called out. Ian thinks he can't go back anymore. The prince extended a hand to help him up. There's someone here I have to protect for the rest of my life. Ian thought to himself. He said he'd get rid of the people who made him suffer. Kalyan asked him what he was muttering about, wondering if it was about revenge. Ian replied that it was because it caused him pain. Kalyan told him to stop, saying the elephant had to stay still or a war would start. Ian said to forget the war. The prince had called him elephant even though he wasn't acting as a member of the Siegfried family. Ian, shocked, asked him if he knew. Kalyan shrugged and smiled. Ian asked since when, to which Kalyan gave a vague answer. Ian said it wasn't something Kalyan should know, adding that he hated his father. Kalyan replied that once he dealt with the banana peel, he wanted some coffee. Kalyan asked Ian if they should bet on whether Ian would grow taller than him in his dreams. Baron saw Kalyan and they stood face to face. Kalyan smiled calmly, while Baron looked surprised. Kalyan then walked towards Baron. He walked close, still smiling, then quickly walked past Baron. Baron watched as Kalyan walked towards two other people who seemed to be old friends. Kalyan then looked at Baron, who was startled by all of this. Baron reached out to Kalyan, who stopped smiling and looked surprised. He smiled again, now with a look of confidence. Kalyan said something that startled Baron awake. Then, Kalyan looked at Baron with a smile, as if he were falling. Baron then fell downwards, and Kalyan simply watched. Baron woke up from the dream, still in Kalyan's body. He sat up in bed, not quite understanding what had happened in the dream. During the funeral held for the previous Kalyan, Manhwa asked if he had truly passed away. Kalyan replied that he thought the other Kalyan might have wanted to experience the things he longed for before leaving, but he was in too much of a hurry and ended up leaving anyway. Kalyan said he would live for him and make sure he fulfilled his wishes. Kalyan said that if this life was like shackles to that child, he was a little envious of his complete freedom. He told Manhwa that he wouldn't pretend not to know that he had already begun many things, and the things others had asked him to help with. He would live his second life well. The core members of Pable's Knights were soon disbanded and returned to Marquis Bryson. Roman stated not to believe the groundless rumors about the royal family. Elon announced he would create a mage corps. 3 months later, Ian and a maid mentioned they needed to call for the tailor. Ian instructed the maid to inform them that there were many clothes in need of mending and that his current attire was becoming too small. Kalyan entered the room where Roman and Elon were waiting. Roman remarked that Kalyan seemed to have grown taller since their last encounter, even commenting that he appeared to surpass King Planche in height. The king inquired whether Kalyan was prepared for Rosetta's arrival. Kalyan replied that he had made all necessary arrangements, as his birthday was fast approaching. Manacer mentioned he needed to introduce someone to Kalyan, which was the reason he had been summoned. This individual would serve as Kalyan's guardian mage during Rosetta's visit. The man entered the room, expressing his honor at meeting the prince. He introduced himself as Arsène Hertz. Kalyan, upon seeing him, was taken aback. Roman explained that Hertz was a talented individual who would become part of the mage corps, expressing his hope that they would learn from each other and grow closer in the process. Kalyan responded with thinly veiled annoyance, stating that this was quite unexpected, a most peculiar birthday present indeed. He inquired when this mage corps would be established. Elon replied that it wouldn't be anytime soon, as they hadn't even settled on a name yet. They lacked numbers, uniforms, practically everything was still undecided. It was a long road ahead. It was merely the beginning, Elon added, while Hertz offered the prince a disconcerting smile. Elon then asked Roman if he would be willing to name the mage corps. Roman, seemingly having already contemplated the matter, as he had been lost in thought for some time, offered a suggestion with a smile. Vulcan. Prince Kalyan seemed to take a liking to the name as well. Elon remarked that Roman appeared to have been waiting to be asked, and it would have been troublesome had he not been. Kalyan then turned to Hertz, inquiring his thoughts. The prince held his teacup, a faint smile playing on his lips as he awaited a response. Hertz asked for clarification. Kalyan explained he was referring to the name Vulcan, and whether Hertz liked it or if it held any familiarity for him. Elon then watched Kalyan and Hertz intently. Hertz, maintaining his smile, replied that it was a good name. Elon, having erected a barrier, reacted with shock upon hearing of Kalyan and Hertz's past connection, asking if he should retract his suggestion. Kalyan stated it wasn't necessary. Elon commented that if things were as Kalyan described, then the prince confirmed that Hertz was the one who had killed him. He acknowledged that Hertz was different now, as were the circumstances. However, he still felt it wouldn't be right to simply let the matter go. Meanwhile, Hertz trembled somewhere, unseen. Kalyan then sought out Bolin, who greeted him. Kalyan remarked that it had been a while, advising Bolin to relax. He apologized for concealing his name and arriving unannounced. Bolin expressed his immense honor at the prince's visit. Kalyan, having refrained from forming alliances with the nobility until now, explained his clandestine visit was a precaution against prying eyes. He stated he wouldn't beat around the bush, getting straight to the point. He had come to collect the reward for saving Bolin's life. He inquired what the Bolin Merchant Association wished to negotiate. Bolin replied that he had recently begun formally trading in diamonds, even exchanging horses with the royal family. But this wasn't the answer Kalyan sought. Bolin admitted he didn't yet possess anything suitable for trade. Kalyan simply smiled at Baron, asking him if he had the capacity to manage matters beyond the Merchant Association. Bolin replied that if he had the staff and the funds, it wouldn't be a problem. Kalyan stated that he had the personnel and the capital, and so did Brisson. Bolin then remarked that he thought he had Kalyan under control. A moment of silence hung between them before Kalyan burst into laughter, admitting that he was right. They did have him under their thumb. Bolin declared that if they had that much money in front of Kalyan, Brisson wouldn't be an issue. Kalyan revealed they were planning to create a mage corps and had ample funds and personnel, but the problem lay in management. Bolin then inquired, was this the price of his life? Kalyan simply offered him a smile, confirming that he had indeed received it at the cost of his life. This left Bolin slightly apprehensive. He agreed to get to work immediately. However, the prince thought to himself his plan had worked. He was supposed to have died after his 15th birthday, but he had changed his fate before that could happen, and now he had people he trusted by his side. All that remained was to find the will of Syphonia within his Rosetta. He wondered why all of this was happening. Then, upon arriving at his birthday party, Kalyan expressed his appreciation for the celebration they had thrown for him. Noting that everything was going perfectly, Planche leaned against a pillar in the hall. The prince went over to speak with him, approaching Planche with a smile and greeting him, remarking that it had been a while since they last saw each other. But Planche ignored him, so the prince walked right past him. Planche called him Blood Eyes. Callian looked back to see the second prince standing there, wearing his usual nonchalant expression. The third prince stated that he wouldn't tolerate it any longer. His name was Callian. Planche laughed and asked Callian. Then he stated that he wasn't Callian. This startled the young prince. Planche continued, saying that he rode horses, wielded swords, and even talked back to people. Then, quickly approaching Callian, he asked him who he really was. Callian was taken aback by the question. Then he thought he couldn't forget. He was no longer the king of Sekharisha. He had lost his homeland to Planche, and this wasn't the mad king who had destroyed Sekharisha. So he concluded, deciding it was best to wait until he obtained the will of Syphonia. He told Planche, with a smile plastered on his face, that he was speaking strangely and kept smiling at the second prince, who simply glared back at him. Moments later, the mage remarked to the prince that if it was Planche, it made sense that he noticed, because even if he was a scoundrel, he wasn't an idiot. The young man looked at the mage with a confused expression. He asked if Planche was a scoundrel, to which the mage replied that yes, it wasn't surprising. The prince gave a small smile, saying he thought so too. He added that he pretended not to understand, but clearly didn't believe it, and asked what they would do to make him believe, since the prince himself said he wasn't anyone else. He was Callian. He stated that the mage was right, adding that he did say that, though the mage regarded him thoughtfully, even saying he wouldn't lead a barren life. The mage's thoughts at the time weren't easily forgotten. Catching the young prince's attention, he offered him a ring, saying that if he ever needed an old man to confide in, he would listen. Callian asked if the ring possessed some sort of communication magic. The mage confirmed it did, explaining he'd placed a sliver of his power within it. He cautioned that it wouldn't function in places saturated with Suspania's power, such as the castle, but he would respond when possible. The prince thanked him, admitting he liked the feeling of connection to his mentor. Manhwa then inquired if something was troubling him, adding with a smile that all the people there were good people. His apprentice questioned whether he truly believed that. A moment later, a man introduced himself as Ulan, commander of the Siegfried Knights. He declared that his knights would protect him until they reached the Suspanian nest. Ironically, Prince Callian had assumed the Siegfried Knights would do just that. He hadn't expected them to be quite so imposing. His servant, Ian, was the eldest son and young master of the Siegfried family. This added a layer of complexity to the situation. Placing a hand on the prince's shoulder, Ian inquired if His Highness required anything before their departure. The prince replied that he needed a drink. When Ian asked if water would suffice, the knights seemed to bristle with indignation. The servant then offered tea as an alternative if water wasn't to his liking, to which the prince readily agreed. As Ian went to fetch the tea, Callian offered his thanks. The prince then turned his attention back to the knights, a faint smile playing on his lips as he observed them. The knights seemed offended by his casual command to Ian. Meanwhile, Manhwa, Carrie, and Hina were taken aback by the prince's behavior. The mage wondered why he was making enemies for no reason. It was a unique opportunity to witness the will of Sigmund Khan Suspania. The entire kingdom was celebrating Callian's birthday. Everyone was watching Prince Karas's coming-of-age ceremony. Even Planche was there to observe, though he didn't seem particularly pleased. On the other hand, the queen was absent. She was in her chambers, enjoying a cup of tea. The prince rode his horse through the crowds, his eyes meeting Manhwa's, and the two exchanged a knowing smile. The prince passed through a large gate, and just then, Rosetta officially began. He'd had an accident before, so I was worried. Wouldn't it be better if you accompanied him? The king asked calmly. The mage replied that there was nothing to worry about. He was more concerned about the prince inside the castle than outside. Setting his cup down on the table, the king remarked that the mage was the same as always, and it wasn't a compliment. He asked if he truly wasn't worried. The mage sighed, thinking that for someone with so many concerns, things had been remarkably different so far. Then the mage answered the king's question, stating that what he said wasn't wrong. The king then exclaimed that that was precisely the part he was referring to. As the prince rode through the forest, he was curious about how the ring worked. He attempted to ask it some questions, but the ring remained silent. He went on, mentioning that he'd heard Tangsil's goods had arrived and the royal palace was in a state of chaos. Ian suggested they should talk to avoid boredom. Callian said he felt responsible for the spectacle he'd witnessed over the past few days and expressed surprise at his servant, who said he'd been trying to talk to him. Ian then turned to the knights, telling them to listen up. For the past few days, he had been observing the unfolding events and expressed surprise that his servant had been trying to speak with him. Ian then turned to the knights and told them to listen. He explained that Prince Kalyan had been declared magically inept by the mages, and when it came to swordsmanship, he barely knew how to defend himself. This meant he was as fragile and delicate as a flower, so they should protect him well. The knights were deeply disappointed that the young master and eldest son of the Siegfried family had abandoned his lordly status to stand by this frail prince. Ian mentioned that it would take another 2 or 3 hours to reach Leland. He asked if they should rest for a bit, when the prince, hearing a rustle in the forest, cut him off. All the knights drew their swords, paying close attention to the noise. Carrie and the mage, Manhwa, prepared to protect the young prince. Kalyan looked towards the source of the sound, thinking to himself that they needn't be so cautious. Then, a creature darted out from the foliage, begging for help. It was just a desperate little elf. Kalyan asked the elf their name, but the elf only said they were hungry. Everyone was shocked that he was being so kind to the elf. The prince asked if they had come because they wanted food and what they were doing there. The elf said they were hiding. The little elf seemed terribly frightened. Kalyan recognized the strangeness of the conversation. One of the knights asked what they should do, and Kalyan said they needed to give the elf something to eat. Then, the young prince heard a noise from within the forest. He turned towards the sound, saying that if someone was following them, the elf should have said so sooner. Then, a man on horseback emerged from the trees. Kalyan took off his cloak and wrapped it around the small elf girl, telling Carrie to hide her. A knight stepped forward and asked the newcomer who he was. The man said he was chasing a thief and asked if they had seen a strange child. The knight replied that they hadn't seen any such child and told him to leave. He then noticed Carrie concealing someone and said he wasn't there to fight the knights. He was just looking for someone and asked if they would let him look around. As numerous lights appeared within the forest, the knight was about to answer, but the prince interrupted, asking what the person he was looking for looked like. The man said it was a young elf. At that, Kalyan gave him permission to check if anything was there. This frightened the young elf girl that the prince would allow him to search. The man began to walk towards Carrie, who was hiding the elf. As he passed the young Kalyan, Kalyan told him not to look back and just listen. The prince said that those accompanying him from behind wouldn't protect him. Their target was him and the child. As soon as he confirms the child's identity, the arrows will rain down from that direction. Before Kalyan could finish his warning, the man turned around. The moment he did, he saw the light intensifying within the forest. A volley of arrows hurtled towards the man, but each shaft snapped in two before reaching its target. Kalyan, with a swift stroke of his sword, deflected the remaining projectiles and knocked the man to the ground, pulling him clear of the deadly trajectory. "I told you not to turn around," Kalyan said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. More arrows whistled from the forest's edge. A knight cried out, "Ambush! Protect the prince!" Then, Manhwa, the mage, cast a shimmering shield spell, deflecting the incoming barrage. Focusing his concentration, he saw the enemy beginning to retreat. The knight commander barked orders to pursue, but not to venture too deep. Kalyan, noting the cessation of arrows, felt certain the attackers had chosen flight. The man, sensing the young prince's relaxed vigilance, and Manhwa preoccupied with the elf girl Kalyan had taken under his wing, saw an opportunity. He approached Kalyan, feigning concern. "Your Highness, are you all right?" he asked, then shouted as if to attract attention. In a flash, the man lunged at Kalyan. "My back!" Kalyan yelled, a warning to his protectors. The attacker, mid-strike, was taken aback. The young prince, with a small dagger, had managed to parry the blow. Having blocked the attack, Kalyan unleashed a burst of magic, striking the man squarely in the chest, sending a jolt of pain through his body. The man crumpled to the ground, a scream of agony escaping his lips. The surrounding knights stared, stunned by the prince's sudden display of power. Could the prince truly wield magic? They wondered. Just then, Ian rushed frantically to Kalyan's side. "Your Highness, are you all right?" he exclaimed. "Your lucky things always turn out well, and we have knights, so why would you step forward?" Inwardly, however, Ian thought, the prince only knows a bit of defense and swordsmanship. He's not proficient in magic. The knights, still reeling from the scene they had just witnessed, found Ian's words utterly inappropriate. What kind of person was this prince? They wondered that Ian spoke of him so casually after he had just incapacitated a man. Minutes later, the young elf girl still trembled with fear. Callian approached her, removing his hood. "We need to talk," he said. His expression was serious. Before he could even ask what she had stolen, she blurted out, "Luca did it. I don't know anything." The elf girl continued to answer questions before Callian could even ask them, insisting she didn't know who stole anything and that the thugs had blamed her. The young prince put a hand to his head, a look of weariness crossing his face. He called for Manhwa, who quickly came to his side. "Sort out what this girl is saying," Callian instructed. "She seems to be answering questions I haven't even asked yet." "Leave it to me," Manhwa replied. The girl looked relieved, while Manhwa, appearing somewhat surprised, began. "This is your report." He relayed the information, explaining that she worked in the Hariska forest and her name was Silestine Uriha. The girl interjected, explaining that her name meant spirit of suppressed words. Manhwa continued, the elf she was traveling with. Silas seemed to have stolen something from the people attacking them. She had gotten separated from Luca while being chased, and that's when she ran into the prince. As she tried to speak, seemingly answering before being asked, Silas interrupted the prince, saying that wasn't the case. The prince gave up on the conversation, suggesting the mage, Manhwa, could handle it. The mage stepped aside, and the girl followed him, and they began to talk, her seeming to trail after him. Ian asked the prince what the plan was, and the prince replied that as soon as they separated from the girl, she would be hunted, so they should leave her near the forest. His servant asked if he intended to resolve the situation, and he said no, as he had a long way to go and there was no reason to get involved. He mentioned he would leave the investigation to the nearest lord. Ian mentioned they would arrive around dinner time. Carrie, the leader of the knights, asked if His Highness had a moment. Carrie said there was something suspicious among the man's belongings and asked if he could examine it. The young prince asked what it was. The knight handed him something wrapped in cloth. When he opened the cloth, the prince was startled by what he saw. Slightly panicked, he asked if the man had possessed this. The knight replied that yes, he did, and asked if the prince knew what it was. The prince said he knew. There was no way he couldn't. It was the same poison he had once been given. He said he needed to see the man himself. As they conversed, someone commented that they had thought he was just a precious young master from a wealthy family, but supposed that wasn't the case. The man concluded, stepping closer, and the prince stated that he was correct. He was an even more precious son from a wealthy family. Holding the vial of poison, the prince said he would be brief and asked if the man knew what it was. The man simply stared at what the prince held in his hand. He said they all had one and figured it was something good, so he stole a few. The prince asked what they were looking for. The man said he wasn't sure. The young prince asked who they were, and the man replied that he couldn't see because of the masks. Callian asked if he remembered anything else. The man said no, and then the prince noticed something odd about him. He knelt down, saying the man didn't seem to be covering for them out of concern for them. He asked what the problem was, and said that if the man cooperated, he would resolve the issue. The prince told the man to trust him. Who knew? Maybe he, the precious son from a wealthy family, could fix it. The man was taken aback by the young man's attitude. He muttered that his wife was in Hanson Village. He knew this. The prince said he would ensure her safety and asked what they had lost. The man said it was a transparent marble about the size of a fingernail. He said he didn't know what it actually was, but they said it had to be examined by a Rayleigh priest to be sure. The young prince thought that meant they had a relic. Relics were used by Rayleigh priests as a substitute for divine power, which was why Rayleigh was trying to acquire as many as possible. The prince now understood why they were making such a fuss, but he wanted to know how they got their hands on that poison, a venom carried by operatives for use in the worst-case scenario of mission failure, secreted away, which is how that man acquired it, through the White Eagle. The man said he didn't know their identities, but he'd overheard the title they used for their leader. Callian asked what it was, and the man replied, Blue Ladybug. Callian was startled at the name, seeming to recognize it. It was the name of one of Burn's father's birds. He wondered what it was doing in Laban's territory so late in the day. Rain lashed down. Inside, speaking with Callian, the man remarked that perhaps the rain was a good thing, as it hampered their progress. He tapped a glass on the table as he spoke, saying he'd been waiting for this day. Overjoyed, the man declared it a great honor. This man was Earl Hale, later the lord of the Radon territory. Still brimming with enthusiasm, he continued, "Look, at a time like this, it's as if the heavens themselves are telling you to serve the prince." Callian thought he was rather loquacious. He recalled his earlier conversation with Ian. Ian had asked if he remembered Earl Hale, one of the people who had sent him gifts before. Callian remembered the name being on the list of donors who retracted their gifts. His servant had asked. Yes, Callian had replied. Though he initially sided with Prince Randall, he quickly switched his support to Prince Plant during the Great Desert and Rastian War 6 years ago. Callian then thought, so that's the opportunist who sent the gifts. The man, still overflowing with cheer, continued to prattle on about how he'd been waiting for the day Callian arrived. Callian figured he must have really been talking to Planch last year. Malcolm Chadish, Earl Hale's steward, seemed deeply embarrassed by the Earl's behavior. Hertz entered from the doorway, requesting permission to speak with the prince. He had something to discuss. He then whispered to Callian that they had intercepted carrier pigeons. Callian knew they were trying to warn the blue ladybug of their presence. No other bird would be flying on such a rainy night unless it had such a purpose. Hale asked Manacer where he was in such cold weather and if he wanted a drink, but Callian replied that they didn't want a drink. They wanted to know if there were any Rastian priests nearby. The man laughed, dropping his wine bottle on the table, and apologized, saying he seemed to be a bit drunk. He asked what Callian was talking about. If it was about Rastian priests, the man flew into a rage, demanding to know if they were talking about those damned bastards who couldn't come to such a remote place. Callian called for the Earl's attention and told him to calm down, but the man continued, ranting that those bastards were evil if Callian looked closely. Before he could finish, Callian snapped his fingers, telling him to sleep, and the man slumped onto the table. Sound asleep, the man lay there. Those in the room were startled by Callian's action. He said he couldn't contain his anger at the man's rude behavior. The scene then shifted to Callian riding his horse. Speaking to Manacer through his ring, the mage asked if he was saying he was involved with a secret item and that his life was now in danger. He went on to say that Manacer was planning to retire, and the young man told him not to worry too much. The mage asked how extensive his network was, and the prince replied that he was someone who had never failed. He continued, saying it was impossible for him not to have noticed that he was Prince Callian and wondered what kind of situation would make someone risk using arrows as an agent. The mage then told him to find a place near Lowen. There, the priests of Rastian were waiting. The mage continued, saying they needed to see what this agent was trying to do. In a certain bar, a woman was cleaning glasses and mugs. Then Prince Callian walked into the bar. He greeted the woman, saying that the men outside were just following him. The woman put down the glass and told him not to worry. She wasn't so cruel as to hurt those who weren't involved. The prince said he thought she had attacked them. Knowing who he was, she replied that that was why she told him not to interfere. The prince then noticed that everyone around him was unconscious. The woman concluded that he was too reckless. The prince walked up to the counter where the woman was. He asked if he was now involved as well. The woman replied that she would say yes, but she looked at the young man, noticing a red aura surrounding him. The woman finally concluded that this wouldn't be easy. The prince looked at the woman and gave a slight smile. He asked if the elf she was after was dead, and she said they lost him when he went up the forest path. Had she known it would be this much trouble, she wouldn't have pursued him in the first place. The woman said, I especially dislike this kind of situation, but since it hasn't caused us too much harm, could you go back and ask that woman and say that she'll let the elf child go? The prince picked up a glass and said he would leave if she answered a few questions and asked why she was looking for the relic. Looking at her through the glass, he said she wasn't a priestess. The woman then showed an angry expression. Snatching the glass from Callian's hand, she said they had become quite expensive recently. He said it seemed she was selling relics, and then the woman said her main job didn't usually pay well. The prince simply observed the woman and asked if the buyer of the relics was in Latwin. He said there was no reason for her to sell them in the countryside, and it would be easier to find priests in Karis. The woman said no one would offer a higher price than this buyer, and he was also someone connected to her. So the prince thought that initially there was only one way of contact between the agents. Someone was selling information about Karis, and now, to pay for the information on the blue ladybug, they were buying relics. The prince then noticed she had poured him some alcohol and looked at the drink. He figured this would be his last question. Not far from the royal palace, the king asked what the mage had come to ask him about, saying that now he was being treated as an informant. Manacer said that when he went there, he knew the king was awake and mentioned there was no reason to go to all that trouble to confirm what the king already knew. He asked how many tinsel priests there were in Karis and where they were. The king then said he didn't know if the mage was asking this question because he knew something or if it was merely a coincidence. Representatives from Tinsel had come specifically for this purpose, and out of the 14 priests in the palace, aside from the one already there, they wanted to find and take the rest so they wouldn't request any more priests. After sending them off to celebrate what they had long desired, it felt uncomfortable as they acted as if Karis was taking advantage of their priests, the king said. Manhwa then said that the situation in Tinsel wasn't very good. He asked, they hadn't revealed their situation, but they needed priests, so what had the king done? The king told them to find the rest and take them. The king asked why the mage was asking this, and Manhwa said Prince Kalyan wanted to know the location of the priests. The king found the prince's question strange and asked why he was asking. Having arrived at the bar where the priests had seen Romain, Kalyan lingered. He posed his question to the woman, wanting to know if the relic bar belonged to Earl Hale of Laban. The woman sipped her drink. Who knows? She said. I don't think that's a simple question, she concluded. The prince returned to his horse and rode off quickly, muttering, that person is pretending not to know. He's hiding the priests and feigning ignorance. After buying relics at high prices, he sells the information to Secretia's agents, Kalyan reasoned. Manhwa confirmed he was right, and the prince declared he should return to the castle. The mage, sensing his urgency, asked if there was a problem. Kalyan admitted there was, suspecting that the earl hadn't been drunk when he'd used magic to put him to sleep at dinner. Meanwhile, at Lallan Palace, someone was shouting, declaring it disrespectful and demanding to know how many times he had to repeat himself. It was Ian speaking to the steward, explaining that the prince had gone for a walk. The steward insisted he needed a quick word with the prince, as the earl wanted to apologize for his behavior. Ian cut him off, asking if he was trying to cover up his own rudeness. He seemed genuinely angry about it. He asked again, since when did the earl's steward question the prince's whereabouts? The steward became quite frightened, unsure how to respond. Ian considered all of this. He reasoned that the prince might not have returned yet. The steward asked again when the prince would be back. Ian yelled at him, saying he couldn't tell him and ordering him to leave immediately. Just then, the prince appeared at the bedroom door, asking if he could get some rest. Both Ian and the old steward jumped in surprise. Kalyan called his servant incompetent. I told you to find a suitable excuse to send him away. How difficult is that? He asked, leaving Ian stunned. His servant apologized, but the steward was insistent, demanding to be put in charge of the matter. The prince slammed the door shut. Outside the room, the steward continued to apologize profusely, saying he hadn't known His Highness was resting and that he would take his leave. Leaning against the door with a sigh of relief, Prince Kalyan felt a flicker of unease. The tone he'd used just moments ago felt eerily like someone else's, and the echo of it unsettled him. His servant, Ian, entered, announcing Kalyan's return earlier than expected. And through the window, no less, Ian added, a touch of disbelief in his voice. It's a long story, Kalyan replied, waving a hand dismissively. Has anyone else looked for me? Anything suspicious happen? Ian confirmed that only the steward had come inquiring. Although, using windows as exits does seem to be a developing habit for your highness, Ian remarked dryly, recalling a previous incident involving a third-story departure. Kalyan chuckled softly. I understand your concern. He paused, then asked why so agitated, Ian. You weren't this flustered back at the royal palace. Ian explained that steward wouldn't leave me alone. Even after I told him you were out for a walk, he kept pestering me about your return. He kept asking and asking. Ian continued, a furrow in his brow. It was odd. He seemed more interested in when you'd be back than where you'd gone. Later, Kalyan spoke with Hertz, the mage. Earl Hale, suspects were investigating something, he said, his voice low. And he's right. He wasn't drunk, Kalyan continued. Hertz raised an eyebrow. Why do you think the Earl feigned intoxication and acted the way he did? The date for the Holy Relic exchange with the Blue Mayfly was today, Kalyan explained. That explains her presence. The drinking was a ruse to slip away unnoticed, but the plan fell apart when I put him to sleep. When he realized I'd left the castle, he sent his steward to investigate. I see, Hertz replied, his expression thoughtful. But why is he so desperate for the Holy Relic? He must want to use it as leverage, Kalyan mused, pacing the room. To curry favor with Tinsel, Prince Randall's mother's homeland, while maintaining his ties with Randall. He's also been courting the favor of the Planche, sending me gifts in secret. He sold information about Karis to the secret sect spies. Hertz realized, his voice hardening. A cunning snake, Kallian muttered, aiding the very Salas that's being hunted. This is just the beginning. The ones hunting her mentioned the blue mayfly. I even discovered Hale sent holy relics to tinsel through the blue mayfly to appease Randall. If all of this isn't a coincidence, the rain won't stop until tomorrow. Kallian finished, his eyes glinting with determination. And since I'm stuck here, I'll deal with this traitor. Back in his room, Hale smashed a glass against the wall in a fit of rage. I should have known Kallian would be trouble when he returned the gifts. He seethed. He must have used some kind of magic. Only magic could induce such a deep sleep. My plans ruined, all because he acted so arrogant, thinking he had Manacer on his side. How could dare someone of common blood think himself on the same level as a prince? Foolish Ceres, Hale thought, his anger simmering. Why didn't she just kill him before all this mess began? I worked so hard to maintain good relations with the nobles. I spent a fortune on Marquis Bryson. They promised me the fertile lands around Karis, but because of Kallian, everything changed, he snarled. Just then, the steward entered the room, bowing low. My lord, if I may. Hale slammed back onto the sofa. Did you manage to speak with the blue ladybug? He demanded. The steward stammered, no, my lord. Perhaps later. Hale hurled a glass at his head. Idiot, can't you do anything right? He raged. It's raining, which means that half-breed is staying here another night. The steward, cowering, asked, should we postpone the exchange then, my lord? We can't. Rewrote. The prince and his men are here. We can't risk it. He bellowed at a passing maid, my clothes. I'll teach that Prince Kallian some manners tomorrow. Hale fumed. Meanwhile, Kallian sat calmly at the table, eating his lunch. Earl Hale glared at the young man. He was acting as if nothing had happened. In Karis, the title of Earl demands respect. Hale seethed inwardly. If the nobles find out someone used magic on me, they won't stand idly by. Your royal blood won't protect you. Foolish little prince, he thought. Soon you'll be begging my forgiveness. Aloud, he said, my apologies for my behavior last night, your highness. Kallian waved a hand dismissively. It's fine. Hale pressed, was magic involved? Before he could finish the question, Kallian answered, a smile playing on his lips. I put you to sleep with magic. You were becoming quite tiresome. He chuckled. Don't worry. It's surely your first time hosting royalty. You must have been nervous. Hale forced a smile, his fury simmering beneath the surface. Kallian was acting as if it were Hale's fault. I've grown tired of investigating who attacked me, Kallian said casually. Was it the man you brought? Hale inwidit. Yes, Kallian replied. We've gathered quite a bit of information. Hale thought he should learn more before asking any questions. It's about the name of a bird, Kallian continued. Hale choked, spraying wine across the table. The steward, startled, scrambled to offer him a cloth. Don't touch me. Hale snip. I'm speaking with the prince. Kallian finished. I need to look into the details further, but I thought you'd want to know what's happening in your territory. Hale stood abruptly. Of course. I'll assist in any way I can. I won't allow the prince to be attacked in my own domain. Inwardly, he fumed. You think I'll let you run rampant on my land? Just you wait. I'll dig into this and find your weakness. A knight approached, requesting an audience with the prince. Watching the knight whisper to Kallian, Hale decided he needed to get the prince out of his territory. Kallian interrupted his thoughts. This message is for you, Earl Hale, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. This person wishes to speak with you. They then proceeded to a place that resembled a prison. Hale bristled at being brought to such a location. You must be feeling what I felt, Kallian observed dryly. But everything is prepared to lure him in. The previous night, in the same location, the man behind bars asked anxiously, has something happened to my wife? He was reassured that his family was fine and reminded of the promise that no harm would come to them. The man asked Prince Kallian why he was there. Kallian replied that the man probably knew by now that he was to be executed. He had attempted to assault a member of the royal family. As soon as the investigation was over, he would be taken to Karis, and it would all be over. Even if he were pardoned, he wouldn't receive proper treatment. His arm would become necrotic, and he would die, Kallian stated. The man then asked what the prince wanted to say. Kallian continued, saying he could offer him a way out. The man was surprised. The prince went on, explaining that he could get him far away from this territory, to a place where he could live peacefully. But I can only ensure your punishment is limited to amputation if you help me in return. The man wore a look of fear. The prince simply maintained his serious gaze. The man agreed to the prince's proposal and asked what he had to do. Then, back in the present, the man said he had asked Earl Hale to come because Mayfly was a secret agent from Secretia. She was there to sell some goods to her client, and she had apparently been meeting with this client for a long time. The prince then said That was strange, because a relationship only lasted that long in the case of a double agent. The great trader merchants selling information. Earl Hale, would you agree? Prince Callian asked, concluding his words. The Earl seemed despairing at all of this, almost speechless. Callian simply waited for the Earl to make a move to provide him with the evidence he needed. Later, in the palace, the steward knelt before the prince, begging for forgiveness, saying that everything he had done was under his master's orders. He wasn't claiming innocence, but begging for mercy. The steward had thought he knew Earl Levon would be caught, but not like this. Then the prince became pensive, asking the steward if he was a priest of tinsel. This took the steward by surprise. He continued, saying that he must have been the one selling the relics. The reason he was so subservient to Earl Levon must have been because the Earl had discovered one of his secrets. The steward then said that if it was discovered he was selling relics, Hansel would cut off his head as soon as he returned. Callian was surprised to find out he sold the relics, so he wasn't trying to buy them. He was puzzled. Then he asked the steward to whom he had sold the relics. The steward replied that he had sold them to Viscount Rhine and Bryson, Queen Ceres' brother. He was sending the relics to Tinsel, the steward said. Rhine and Bryson had established a connection with Tinsel, meaning he had betrayed Blanche and sided with Randall. So he had turned his back on Ceres and his own family, the Bryson family who wanted the Blanche family's power. Speaking with Manacer the mage, Prince Callian said that the trap he had set to catch the Earl had caught something much bigger. The mage asked what he planned to do next. Callian said it was a matter that would cause an uproar and asked if they should discuss it with Roman first. The mage agreed. Callian requested that before that, he should write a letter to Earl Hale of Lowen. Prince Callian ordered his servant to tend to the man imprisoned below. The wound on his arm was severe, requiring considerable time to heal. Amputation might even be necessary. Afterward, he instructed them to give the prisoner food, then produced a vial of poison. The knight acknowledged the order and confirmed he would inform Callian's men to find the man's wife in Hansel village and bring her somewhere safe after the prisoner had taken the poison. The prince was interrupted by Sheena, a small sprite who dashed into his room. She announced that she had come with Hina, even without permission. Before Callian could question her, she added that she was saying this preemptively so he wouldn't be angry with Hina. The girl then ran towards the bird. Callian thought to himself that this wasn't his problem. She reached the bird and began to play with it. Ian asked the prince what he planned to do with the pigeon, whether he intended to keep it. No, Callian replied. You're wondering when I'll return it to its owner. He concluded. Hina also began to play with the pigeon. Callian and Ian simply watched her. The prince then declared that he would give her a bird of her own once they returned to the royal palace, as he needed to return this one tonight. Hina started to say that Merlin might not like having a bird in their room. The prince just smiled and said, regretfully, that he would have her help him release the bird after dinner. He also told her not to forget to open the window. She seemed puzzled. Callian explained that he was expecting a visitor. Several hours later, everyone had left the prince's room, leaving him alone to read. Hearing a noise at the window, he closed his book and remarked that the person had arrived earlier than expected. The visitor then spoke, saying they were deeply moved by the contents of the letter, which stated that if she didn't want her actions reported to Nyrantia, she should come to see him. It was the blue mayfly. She demanded to know why he was threatening her. Prince Callian pulled a paper from his book, stating he had evidence that Earl Hale was negotiating for artifacts and selling information. As long as you give them to me, I'll keep your secret, he offered. The woman simply stared at him silently. He asked if that was her answer. She replied that it was. She added that she hated complicated relationships. Then she hurled several magic projectiles at him. Callian, seeing the magical orbs flying towards him, was startled. He quickly erected a magical barrier to protect himself, thinking that in the past, this woman had used a sword. All the projectiles were deflected, striking the walls with a clatter. The knights outside grew agitated, sensing an intruder in the prince's room. Callian locked the door, telling them not to enter. He asked the woman if she truly intended to kill him. Is there anything else? The woman snapped, rushing towards him. There's nothing else. She drew her sword and lunged at the prince. Callian parried the blow, knowing his ordinary iron sword wouldn't hold against her imbued blade. He needed to end this fight quickly, without using his own magic. Then, the prince managed to land a blow on the woman, but she swiftly raised her sword to defend herself. In that instant, the prince succeeded in disarming her. but just when he least expected it, Mayfly had another magic orb ready. She hurled it towards him with a speed that defied interception without the use of mana. Callian swiftly enveloped his sword in a protective aura of energy. He managed to cleave the orb in two, but the force of the impact proved too much for his blade. It snapped, seeing him bisect the orb. Mayfly asked if he was a Swordmaster. A tense silence hung between them. Prince Callian, considering his next move, addressed her by her true name, Isla. The woman was visibly startled. As she began to question how he knew her name, Callian seized her face, his grip firm. "What are you doing?" she demanded. He forced her mouth open, peered inside, and stated, "The poison that should be there isn't." Then, Callian pressed her for answers. "Tell me what you know. Will you let me go if I tell you?" She asked. "I've heard the members of the secret sect are resolute," Callian replied, "but I don't think you are." He wondered if she had always been this way, or if something had changed her. "It would be best to let me go," Isla insisted. "A Swordmaster," she continued, carrying a sword inferior to a guard's, as if trying to hide your skill. "If you don't want to be caught, let me go. Otherwise, I'll tell the knights outside everything I've seen." In another timeline, Isla's words echoed in his mind. The blue Mayfly is loyal to the secret sect. A Swordmaster focused on her blade. "This isn't you," Callian thought, grabbing her shirt. "If you go this far to beg for your life," he said, "you shouldn't die in front of me." His words clearly shook her. Silence fell between them again. He released his grip on her shirt. "Don't expect anything," he told her. "This isn't a great secret worth your life." He instructed her to reveal one piece of evidence, and he would spare her the interrogation. He added that the interrogation would be conducted by the White Eagle, a prospect that terrified her. Not far away, a man cursed loudly. It was Earl Hale. "Where's Malcolm?" He raged. "I haven't seen him yet." "What happened? What was in that letter?" he demanded. "The letter states that the Earl needs someone to represent him. I explained to Queen Ceres what you've been selling so far, so rest assured, there's nothing to worry about." "This letter was written by Alamaneser," Hale seethed. "Does that mage know about the relic?" "If he sent a letter, he probably knows," Hale continued. "Who does that mage think he is, threatening me?" I had to bow my head to that damned commoner prince. How irritating. He must think I'll come crawling to him, but he shouldn't underestimate me. He thinks I didn't prepare anything beforehand, Earl Hale snarled. He entered a room overflowing with treasure, his gaze sweeping over it. He thought he could gather more. Walking towards the vault, he declared, "It doesn't matter," convinced he possessed something far more valuable. He opened a small box brimming with holy relics. With this many, he muttered, "I can amass a fortune." He was still musing on how best to dispose of his ill-gotten gains when Hertz materialized behind him. Just as Earl Hale reached to close the lid, the box vanished from his grasp. He spun around, startled, to find both box and Hertz now in the mage's possession. "Is that invisibility magic?" It. Hertz nodded. "Indeed, and I am Prince Kalian's mage." "I am most grateful," Hertz continued, a hint of steel in his voice. "You've delivered the evidence into my hands yourself, Earl." He offered a thin smile. "Don't worry. I'll be sure to inform that slippery mage of yours, and that damned commoner prince." The mage then brought the relics to Callian. "I've also brought all the leaked documents concerning Karis and the relic trade orchestrated by Hale," he reported. A smile played on Callian's lips. "Thank you, Hertz. Thanks to you. This mess is almost resolved." Just then, Ian pounded frantically on the door, calling out to the prince. "Your Highness, look outside." He gestured urgently, and Callian turned to see knights clad in gleaming golden armor approaching. A large contingent of mounted men drew nearer. Callian watched from the window, his brow furrowing. "Those are King Kara's personal knights," he murmured, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "What are the knights who are supposed to be protecting the king and Karis doing here?" Our video ends here. If you liked it, please like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time. Bye-bye.